Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today, we're starting part 1 of an awesome What If Deku was kidnapped and rescued by All Might story. If you want to see part 2, drop a comment below and tell me what you think. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Now let's jump into the story. It was cold in his cage, darkness surrounding him even with the light of dozens of monitors cutting through the shadows. The beeping of machines and dripping of the pipes overhead were not enough to muffle the sounds coming from the other cages. Wheezing of lungs barely working to take a vital, sometimes final breath. Growls and grunts of creatures in deep, fitful sleep. The grinding of non-human teeth against metal bars. Izuku had learned days ago that crying would work no more. It would not make his mother appear to calm him down as it always did. It would not alert people nearby that he was in danger. It would do nothing for the pain in his tiny body or the hunger gnawing at his empty stomach. At the mere age of 2, the only thing he was capable of doing by himself was walk and talk a mile a minute, holding onto his mother's skirt as she smiled down at him. That was the last thing he remembered before he was brought here, forcefully ripped from his mother's grasp as she screamed and ran after him. A useless effort as a mass of black goo enveloped him and took him away into this unknown place, where he had been shoved into this jail and promptly been forgotten unless they came by to prod at him to make sure he hadn't gone into shock. He had been hopeful at first, having just begun to learn about heroes and what great feats they were capable of. He was sure they would come for him to deliver him into his mother's arms once more, bright smiles shining down on him as they ruffled his hair and told him to be careful next time, just like how he always saw on TV. Then the days started passing. Truth is, Izuku couldn't tell very well how much time had passed. For a boy his age, a minute could feel like an hour, hours like days, and days like weeks. There were no clocks or windows anywhere. The passing of time was a myth that only the whisper of a door sliding open was able to provide, and even then it was all subjective. He'd spent the first few hours of his capture crying and screaming for help until he passed out of exhaustion and stress. He'd wake up who knows how long after, forgetting where he was and what had happened to him, thinking he'd fallen asleep on the cold kitchen floor while watching his mother cook like how he'd done multiple times before. But then he'd remember everything and the wailing would begin anew. The other cages, whatever was in them, would react to his cries and answer them, screeching and gurgling noises filling the room until Izuku's throat was raw. Some of them had stopped making noise after some time, now just lying still in a lump in their place, never betraying a sign of life. After some time the doors would open and a couple of people would walk in, opening the cages of the immobile ones and dragging them out, ignoring Izuku's shouts for help. Sometimes they would come for him, pick him up and carry him like luggage to another room with even more machines. He'd be strapped to a chair, prickled with needles too big for his tiny veins as red flowed out of him towards the machines, everyone ignoring his trembling chin and watery eyes. After a few times of this he'd just lay boneless like a doll, letting them do whatever they wanted. Food and water seemed like a faraway dream, his tummy not even growling anymore to complain. Every time his BLD was drawn, a different tube would flow something towards him, a pinkish liquid that must have been the only thing keeping him alive, enough to keep his heart beating but not to help him escape. Not that he could even scratch the bars of his cage with his tiny, rounded nails. It was a day, night, evening. That everything around him was quiet. The beeping of the machines had long since blended into the background of his mind, and not a single one of the creatures in the neighboring cages was moving anymore. He was lying on his back, staring blankly at the steel roof on top of him and trying to remember what color the sky was when the door opened again. His arms throbbed in response, the wounds from countless needles still bleeding under his bandaged skin. The rest of him stood still. "Is this all your investigation could achieve?" A deep masculine voice said, skiing as he walked around the room. White light flooded the place, blinding Izuku as if someone had set fire to his eyes. A different voice spoke. "It's all part of the preliminary process. We have to eliminate all possible weaknesses of the transition before trying for bigger ones. It's all about protecting assets, sir," the first man hummed, his heavy steps getting closer as he walked through the cages. "Weaknesses," he said, his voice low and grating. "A necessary step to reach the most powerful creature alive, I guess." The steps turned around, slowing down as they approached the cage holding the trembling child curled up trying to protect his eyes. They stopped right next to him, the sound of sterile tile squeaking against shoes as the man crouched down to look inside. "And who is this little guy?" the man asked, only curiosity in his voice. Not a single hint of worry about the emaciated toddler inside. "We wanted to test how the process would work in someone without a developed quirk. A child below the age of presentation seemed appropriate," the second man chuckled. "Ironically enough, one of our tests revealed his quirkless. 2 joints in his pinky toe. Should I start with him now, then?" "Not yet, no. We're still running preliminary tests on him. We did a lot of blood work before we discovered his quirkless, so we had to remake those with a different point of view." Izuku's tremors had intensified under their words. Quirkless. Izuku was still young, but he developed mentally at a rate most people classified as genius, and his speech was at par with a 5-year-old. He knew well what that word meant, and it scared him and saddened him terribly. Wasn't a quirk what all heroes had? "Oh well," the man with the deep voice said, straightening up. "Just make sure he doesn't die until you have some results. He looks ready to keel over. We'll reinforce his nutritional supplement," the second man said, following the other out of the room. The lights were turned off once more, and as the door closed behind them, Izuku uncovered his face to be swallowed in darkness once more. One time, a few weeks ago, Izuku had run up to his mother to complain how bored he was and pull her to play with him. Now, laying on the cold metal of his jail, he missed the rainy days where his only entertainment was watching the drops fall from the clouds. How long had he been here? How was his mom? Were the heroes looking for him? Izuku would have laughed had he had the energy for it. Of course they were heroes. It's just that this place was hidden very, very well. Obviously. No other reason they'd take so long. They hadn't given up on him. The 2 men from that time had come again a number of times after a few generic faces had emptied and cleaned the other cages. They'd come back with more of the grotesque creatures to fill them back up. Each time they were larger, making more noise and causing a ruckus as they slammed against the cages until an annoyed worker would come in and poke them with a stick that had them screeching and left a smell of burned flesh clogging the air. Would they have used that stick on him if he hadn't stopped crying so long ago? The times they took him to the chair were farther and farther apart each time, and so the amount of the pinkish liquid they gave him diminished as well, leaving him tired and disoriented. It was kind of a blessing in disguise though. He was so famished and dehydrated he would pass out most of the time, making the imprisonment a bit more bearable. Sometimes he woke up and there were new bandages on his arms, and he'd be in a position he hadn't been in when he fell asleep, as if he'd been carelessly thrown back into the cell and just left there, without care if his leg was twisted wrong or if his arm ended up underneath him and had lost all sensitivity by the time he regained consciousness. He was so weak he could barely lift his head, and the world swung around his vision every time he tried to move a muscle, which is why he didn't question it when the ground shook in a muted movement. He must have been imagining it. But then it happened again. Izuku blinked, his dry eyes nearly sticking shut from the movement. The tremors kept happening, each time closer to each other and feeling nearer and nearer as they passed. An earthquake. The door slammed open and a bunch of people in white coats rushed in, turning on the lights to Izuku's great pain. They ran to the monsters in the other cages and did something that Izuku could not see from his supine position, but it must have been painful as the room was filled with horrible screaming. The sounds that followed were of metal doors being opened and immobile lumps of flesh being carried away by the men through another door Izuku had never noticed before in his terror. He'd been left behind, alone. The ground kept shaking, but this time it wasn't just that. He could hear shouting, yelling and explosions. The sound of a wall crashing down and then footsteps. Coming. Running. Towards him. Izuku would have whimpered if his throat didn't feel like sandpaper. Those footsteps were ones he could identify easily, heavy and with a purpose, even when their owner was running instead of calmly strolling through. His cage was in the front of the room, in the middle of the first row, directly in front of the main door. Rushing in through the open door, the man breathed as he stopped in front of his cage, fumbling to open it. Izuku could see the blooded hand reaching down towards his face. And then, as soon as it had appeared, it was gone. The man roared in rage as he was pulled back, and the laugh that filled the room had Izuku almost jumping to his feet. The only thing he felt, however, was a jolt of pain at the mere thought of moving his muscles. There were more noises, this time right next to him, and Izuku could identify most of them from all the videos he'd seen of heroes at the job. A body being slammed against a wall and pummeled mercilessly. Concrete cracking from an unimaginable force. Grunts of pain. Grunts of anger. The muted sound of an unconscious body hitting the floor. Breathing. More voices were coming closer, but Izuku could barely process what they said as he focused on the new, big, clean hand that had appeared in his field of vision. It touched his face gently, and it was so rough, so calloused, so warm. Izuku would have cried if he still had had enough tears to do so. He was moved, gently, lifted up with a care he hadn't felt in what seemed like a lifetime. A couple of hands big enough to hold his entire tiny body, one cradling his head and supporting his fragile neck muscles, the other holding his back and legs. Cupped like a newborn puppy. The face that came into view was what Izuku had been dreaming about for so long, he almost thought he was having another hallucination. The bright eyes. Strong jaw. Blonde hair pulled up in twin bangs high above his head. The smile that set millions of hearts at peace, toned down to a gentler, softer, sadder curve of the mouth. Willing strength from his very soul and feeling like he swallowed sand with every breath, Izuku opened his mouth to utter his first words in months. Or might. The tiny child passed out in the hero's arms, and the symbol of peace could not stop the rebel tears that rushed down his cheeks. Finding All for One's hidden lab had been a job of weeks. When a frantic woman had come running into the police station, screaming about her baby having been taken from her own arms by a strange black goo, they knew it was something out of their power. The person in the district with the best connections to local heroes was Detective Tsukochi, who had arrived soon after to interrogate the frantic young woman, so young, so much terror in her face, to make sure her panic wasn't clouding her memories. If her son had disappeared right in front of her eyes, then this was a job better suited to heroes than the police force. Her words rang true every single time, and so Tsukochi had thrown himself into the investigation. There had been some previous reports the past years about people disappearing in similar ways, out of nowhere, in front of anyone bearing witness, swallowed up by a black mass. One of the missing people had been large enough that a bystander could take a couple seconds of video before he was taken away, and upon seeing the recording Inko Midoriya had burst into tears. The disappearances had been going on sporadically for the past months, but it seemed it was this particular case of a kidnapped kid that sent the public into a panic. If they would take a child, then who was safe? Leads were non-existent. No evidence was left behind, no pattern was found, no criminal organization had claimed credit for the panic in the streets. Tsukochi was at a stall for days. The boy's mother would be at his office almost daily, asking for any update or offering to help. There was little she could do, but Tsukochi could not bring himself to ask her to leave. The loss of a son was something he couldn't imagine the pain of, and he would not deny the poor woman the company she so desperately needed. With every passing day she looked thinner, hair messier and eyes duller. It was difficult to function when the light of your life had been ripped from you so suddenly. It wasn't until a day when Tsukochi was taking a break, and by God did it feel awful to spend a second without looking for that child, that he saw a light at the end of the tunnel. His friendship with All Might was not well known to everyone, but they were close enough to warrant occasional calls when the number one hero could answer. He just wanted to get some weight off his shoulders, maybe a bit of advice in how to proceed the investigation when all his resources were dwindling. All Might had sounded sympathetic, having heard the news through the grapevine rather than the media, and wanted to help Tsukochi as much as he could. Until he mentioned the black goo. All Might had gone silent, and then asked him if he was sure. He'd answered yes, he was. The mother had recognized the method on a video. All Might told him he'd talk to him later, abruptly ending the call and leaving Naomasa blinking astounded at his phone. His astonishment grew even more when a mere hour later All Might himself landed in front of his door. He really could clear cities just in a couple of leaps. "Naomasa, show me the video," he'd say in lieu of a greeting, his face serious as he'd never seen it before. While watching the recording, his face turned sour, eyebrows furrowing severely and casting his face in angry shadows. His ever-smiling visage twisted into a snarl. All Might had not only given him a lead. He'd given him a name. All for One. Tsukochi whispered in disbelief. His lie detector quirk had rendered it impossible for Toshinori to keep the secret of his quirk when first asked by the detective, and so he knew all the story and truth of his powers, including its origins. The villain Toshinori spoke of was not new to him, but it was a name he'd only heard from his friends' stories, a being of tale that seemed too high above mere mortals to bother people in their small community. What was the biggest criminal of Japan doing kidnapping a 2-year-old boy? All Might had delegated his agency in Roppongi to all his sidekicks except for one. A willowy man with a serious face who seemed just as infuriated at the mention of the villain and his recent deeds, even if his face never betrayed a thought. The first thing they did was meet the unconsolable mother. The woman couldn't believe her eyes at seeing the imposing figure smiling softly down at her, offering his hand in a greeting far too Western for her. She accepted to shake his hand, because the physical reassurance of the greatest hero having come to her aid personally was something she didn't know she needed. Izuku would have lost his mind, his favorite hero right here, for the world to see. The other man settled for a deep bow, his stature making her feel like a building was coming down in front of her. Sir Night-Eye, he'd introduced himself, the main sidekick of All Might who had come to help find her son as much as he could. And the first order of the day was gently asking to touch her arm. Staring into the haunted eyes of the woman, Inko almost fainted when a small smile tugged at the lips of the stoic man in front of her. "Midoriya-san," he said in a calm, soothing voice. "I don't know exactly when or how long it will take, but I can assure you this, you will have your son, safe and sound, back in your arms." Inko had collapsed to the ground, only avoiding falling completely by the strong arms of All Might catching her on the last second. She'd caught her footing again, and promptly launched herself at Night-Eye, crying in a mix of relief and stress that had her exhausted in a couple of minutes, asleep on the couch in Tsukochi's office with Toshinori's huge jacket enveloping her completely. The search had taken a new turn upon learning of the culprit, with nearly half the hero force participating to not only save the child and all the other people kidnapped, but also to bring down the biggest villain of all. The principal of UA had joined in with tactical support, mapping out the most likely areas where they could be hiding. Rescue heroes by the dozens searched every nook and cranny for suspicious activity while All Might followed any trace of All for One's presence, always ending up in dead ends. Every hour, every day, every week that passed made them grow more frantic. Not even the reassurance of Night-Eye's vision slowed them down. It didn't matter that the kid would eventually be saved, it mattered that any second he was not found was a second he was at the not mercy of that monster. It was nearing the mark of 4 months when they finally found the place. Even with the ongoing search, the heroes still encountered villains on the daily. These fights usually derailed them from the search for hours or even days if the damage was too extensive. One of these villains, with a quirk that allowed him jump up several feet in the air and drop with the weight of a mountain, had left a gigantic crater where he had attacked, and while the wild pussycats evaluated the damage for Pixibob to recover the terrains. Natural shape, Ragdoll felt it. Multiple presences that she had not felt before during their search, hidden deep below the ground and out of range of her quirk. It was a feeling that sent chills down her spine. Multiple average people, a single one with a weakness so small she couldn't define it, a few beings who seemed to be suffering merely by being alive. And then there was him. Such a faint presence, with so many vulnerabilities, a frail body, a shaken psyche, soft bones still developing, and a heartbreaking lack of the very essence that filled most heroes. So many weak points could only belong to a child. A terrified, hurt child. It had been hard to pinpoint the entrance to the laboratory, and All Might had to convince himself to not resort to punching a hole through the earth lest he wanted to accidentally bury the innocent people inside. It had been nerve-wracking. Night-Eye had to walk past several buildings for days, accidentally bumping into people who came out of them and shaking his head with each one. It was times like these he cursed the inability of his quirk to be used more than once a day. When he finally managed to hit the jackpot and touch someone who worked for the villain, it was time to formulate the plan and storm the place. The cover was, ironically enough, a pharmaceutical lab. The entrance was controlled by a buzzer and was supposed to keep intruders out and secrets in. A well-placed punch sent the door flying off its hinges, setting off an alarm that had the few people inside scrambling down a hallway. As the heroes stormed the place to apprehend everyone on sight, All Might and an entourage of the strongest heroes of the city made their way down towards where they were running off to, guiding them right to their boss in their panic. The elevator that the men in lab coats clambered into was easily ripped out of the tunnel and thrown to the side as All Might jumped down, dropping for what felt like hours as the ground never seemed to get closer. He finally touched down with a mighty impact that shook the ground, and the thick steel doors closing off the main lair were torn apart by his bare hands. Inside, even more people scurried away, screaming and setting fire to every visible file, laptop or machine they left behind to eliminate as much evidence as possible. All Might rushed through the lab, knocking people out easily at speeds the human eye couldn't register. As he went deeper and deeper through the labyrinthine halls, he stopped at a bend at the sight he caught at the very end. His greatest enemy, his MSTR's murderer. All for one running out of a room, making eye contact for a second before bolting down another hall. Dread curled in the pit of Toshinori's stomach, thinking what could be so important the villain didn't charge to attack him. He ran after him, slamming his feet on the walls for greater propulsion as he gave chase. There was a door at the end of the hall, seemingly the last corner in this endless maze, and All for One seemed desperate to reach it before All Might reached him. It didn't happen, and All Might slammed his fists hundreds of times in a second on the villain's back, throwing him against the wall and repeating the process on his face. All for One finally activated one of his many stolen quirks, sending out a repelling wave that threw the hero off of him. He wiped the BLD out of his eyes and hurried through the door. The kid was the only one left in his cage, all the other subjects disposed of and taken away by the workers who had managed to get away while All for One took care of all the data in his own office. He'd almost reached the kid when All Might grabbed his leg, pulling him back and smashing him into the ground, finishing the job with inaught strength and rage behind each punch to finally put the villain out of commission. The BSTRD was just too powerful to drop dead from that, it seemed. Not that it mattered where he was going. Leaving the actual capture of the man to the heroes that came in after him, Toshinori busied himself with the fragile form laying inside the cage. He was so small, all skin and bones, sunken cheeks and dull eyes staring up into nothingness. His hands had never been as gentle, as careful as he was while picking up this child, this baby that had done absolutely nothing to deserve this fate. When the boy set his eyes on All Might's face, his green eyes lit up with a gleam that left the hero weak on the knees, and when little Izuku used the last dregs of his strength to say his name, awe and reverence in each syllable, Toshinori felt his heart tear itself out of his chest and land in the hands of the creature in his hold. Izuku was so small in comparison to the bed he was in any other situation it would have been funny. Not this time though. Children's hospitals had much more appropriate beds, smaller and softer to accommodate them better. Colorful and covered in animal-printed sheets to bring some joy to the kid using it. Izuku's condition upon his rescue had been so severe he had to be rushed to a hospital more suited for hero injuries than civilians. No other hospital had the amount of available equipment that he needed to survive the shock he fell in after being rescued. No civilian hospital expected someone so young to be in the state he was in. The sudden rush of adrenaline after realizing he was being saved had almost sent Izuku into cardiac arrest, his little body falling limp in All Might's hands as he passed out. After that it was a rush to get out of the underground lab and to the surface, which Toshinori managed in record time with the only structural damage being the fake lab used as cover that he blasted through to reach the ambulance waiting by the site. Luckily his little heart was still beating when they hooked him up to the monitors, but it was so faint it might as well have not. All Might had to remind himself he would only slow down the ambulance with his weight if he rode with the little child, almost reluctant to let him out of his sight before remembering he could reach the hospital in a couple of minutes with a well-placed leap. Musutafu was a really small city compared to Tokyo. He made sure the unconscious body of All for One was being taken away for his immediate arrest and imprisonment properly, and then took off. He arrived in time with the ambulance, making his way in right when they were wheeling little Izuku into the emergency room, an oxygen mask placed firmly on his face as the hospital lights made his pale skin seem even more so. The boy's mother arrived not long after, scrayed by Tsukochi himself, who made quick work of getting rid of the media swarming the entrance as if summoned by the sight of All Might jumping through the buildings, completely out of place in their small city. They didn't even know about the child they'd just rescued. just wanted to get as many camera time of the #1 hero as they could, as they speculated what he was doing so far from the capital. 𝐒𝐭 had been frantic, looking around as if her son would just appear from one of the doors and run into her arms. Toshinori had walked up to her, settling a gentle hand on her shoulder. "He'll be fine," he told her softly. Her green eyes a perfect copy of her son's as he had gazed up at the hero minutes ago. "Remember what Sir Night Eye said. He'll be safe and with you sooner than you realize." 𝐒𝐭 took a shaky breath, hands clutched over her chest. I just can't believe it. He's right here and I can't, he's not." "You will see him soon," Toshinori reaffirmed, his other hand joining the other so both were a firm anchor on the small woman's shoulders. Was everyone in this family so small? He was. Not in the best conditions, he admitted. He had to be rushed here due to the gravity of his state. "I've seen similar cases before. Chances are he'll have to stay here for a while, but you might be allowed in before the day ends." Her lower lip trembled, fat tears collecting at the corners of her eyes. All Might have been a bit ashamed to admit later even his superpowered senses didn't allow him to foresee the speed at which she threw herself at him, hugging him with as much force as her soft arms allowed against his muscled form. All Might was the kind of hero that was usually too busy to properly interact with his fans. It was always defeat the villain and jump immediately to the next emergency. He wasn't used to this kind of contact since most people around him were too intimidated or too in awe to consider he might be okay with the occasional handshake or one-armed hug for a camera. If his memory served him correctly, this was the first time he was embraced so wholly since his MSDR's passing. He carefully wrapped his arms around the woman, barely managing to wound around her shoulders with their height difference. This case had dragged him all the way here to finally find and capture his greatest enemy, with the consequence of this poor woman's innocent child suffering for it to be made possible. Toshinori could allow himself a moment to offer her the reassurance she so desperately needed now that it was all over. When 𝐒𝐭 was finally allowed to see her son, she fought to keep her breathing even as she followed the nurse down the hospital halls. The kind woman leading her tried to talk to her all the way there, about how brave her son was and how strong he was to have endured all that time on his own. 𝐒𝐭 recognized the attempt to make her feel better, but she could only think how she would have preferred her son to not have gone through all this at all, brave or not. The room she was let into was way too large for the little figure of her son. Izuku swam under the sheets of a bed too big even for her, and connected to the back of his hand, administering him the nutritious fluids that would be his main source of food and water for a few days as his body got used to solids again. An oxygen mask was secured over his mouth, likely brought over from some other hospital's pediatric wing, seeing how it was properly child-sized. Izuku's muscles were so weak he had trouble expanding his ribs to breathe on his own. A tiny children's neck pillow prevented his head from lollying around as his neck muscles couldn't handle the strain just yet. His arms were covered in bandages. "Oh," 𝐒𝐭 whispered, both hands covering her mouth to hold back the sobs racking her frame as she moved to stand by her son's bed. She would be DM'd if she interrupted her little angel's rest with her crying. It seemed like it was just yesterday when she got the positive 𝐷𝐴𝐺𝐸 test. Seemed like hours when she carried him within her, excited to finally meet the new life she was creating. Seemed like seconds since Izuku was born, screaming into this world and ready for all the adventures life had waiting for him. He was only 2 years old. It wasn't fair. It wasn't fair. 𝐒𝐭 could only pray Izuku would forget about the experience, that her overwhelming love and attention might be able to erase any trace of this moment from his memory. But her baby was also so smart. He was already more vocal than most kids his age, and could hold semi-coherent conversations with her with no problem. They'd even created their own little language, a mix of hand signals and specific noises with a sprinkle of actual words. It was an entire system that Izuku had come up with, and it was such a special thing she shared with her little light. "How could I let this happen to you?" she cried, dropping her face into her hands and quietly sobbing into them. The soft click of the door handle turning alerted her of someone opening the door, and it startled her into standing up straight, forgetting to wipe the tears drying on her cheeks. The looming figure of All Might dressed in casual clothes stood by the door, awkwardly hovering there without entering the room as his eyes traveled between 𝐒𝐭 and her son. A plastic bag hung from his hand. "Midoriya-san," he greeted, finally deciding to step inside, carefully sliding the door shut behind him. Sorry for the disturbance, and not at all, 𝐒𝐿 could only say as she dried the tear tracks from her cheeks. He went past the bed and towards the little table near the chairs on the other side of the room, setting the bag down. I brought you some things from the cafeteria, he said, voice small and completely out of place with his image. I imagine you won't want to leave him anytime soon, so. She smiled, huffing a laugh as she covered her mouth. Thank you, All Might, please, call me 𝐿𝐿, he said. It was a risk to let people know his true name, but it was common enough to let it slide this one time. Besides, he felt like he would be seeing the child and his mother very often, and didn't want her calling him by his hero name all the time. 𝐒𝐿 smiled, eyes crinkling in that way Toshi couldn't help but compare to Nana's smile. Thank you, 𝐿𝐿. He stayed for a while, moving over one of the chairs to sit by the bed after making sure with the nurses that 𝐒𝐿 could lie down on the bed next to Izuku. She ran her hands through her son's hair, working out tangles and matted strands as best as she could. Izuku would be able to get a sponge bath once he woke, but even with 4 months' worth of dirt, 𝐒𝐿 could not stop touching him, making sure he was there at her side. She and 𝐿𝐿 talked and talked about the differences between Musutafu and Tokyo, the intricacies of hero work, their favorite time of the year, Izuku's obsession with katsudon since the moment he could chew solid food. They talked about anything and everything under the sun, everything except the secret lab Izuku had been kept in and his kidnapping and subsequent rescue. It was not necessary at the time. Midoriya-san, 𝐿𝐿 started, fumbling with his pockets. I'd like you to have a way to contact me, if you ever need it. 𝐒𝐿 shook her head. Oh no, I wouldn't like to impose, I insist, he said, pulling out his phone. I'll be staying in the city for a while, to work out the case with Detective Tsukochi. Even through these terrible circumstances, you and your son have made it possible for us to capture who might be the most dangerous villain in the country. 𝐒𝐿's eyes widened in surprise. Had it really been someone like that who had taken her son? She finally relented and took out her own phone, exchanging numbers while trying not to feel too giddy. Sure, Izuku was more of a hero fan than her even at his age, but this was the #1 hero who had given her his personal number. She might have been a bit of a fan herself, but could control herself well enough. Had this happened when she was just a teenager, she probably would have been jumping and crying in joy. 𝐿𝐿 stood up, sparing a last worried but relieved glance at Izuku. I have to get going now. Detective Tsukochi should be coming by sometime later today or tomorrow to talk to you, she nodded. I'll be right here. He might want to talk to young Midoriya once he awakens, as well. His gaze traveled to the sleeping child. I know he's too young to be able to answer many questions, and also will be very tired, but Tsukochi is really good with children and will make sure to not overstep any boundaries. 𝐒𝐿 looked conflicted, hands stilling on her baby's hair. Izuku is smarter than you might think, and he can speak well enough to hold a conversation. Her hand went to hold her son's little one. I'll let him talk to Izuku when he's strong enough to speak, but I will stop him if I see Izuku becomes uncomfortable. She frowned then, hard eyes fixed on his face, determined. 𝐿𝐿 smiled, glad to see the little boy had such a strong woman protecting him. He wouldn't have put it past her to have jumped all for one herself had she come across the man. I would expect nothing less, Midoriya-san. For the next few hours Izuku slept. He seemed to be having trouble getting used to the soft bed, occasionally wriggling in place or grunting as he tried to turn around, but 𝐒𝐿 held him firm against her side so he wouldn't get tangled in the wires and tubes monitoring him. Contrary to what one might think, he didn't react negatively to physical touch, but rather seemed to sink into it, fingers trying but failing to close around hers and nuzzling as much as he could against her chest with the oxygen mask in the way. It was as if he recognized her through his dreams. 𝐒𝐿 hoped they were nice dreams. She spent the night awake, looking over him and guarding his sleep. Every once in a while a nurse would pop in quietly, bow quickly to apologize for the interruption and jot down Izuku's vitals before leaving. At some point a doctor walked in to check on him as well, and 𝐒𝐿 noticed she wasn't wearing her white coat. If it weren't for her introducing herself as Izuku's doctor on shift, 𝐒𝐿 would have thought she was another nurse. It's a precaution we're taking with him, in case he wakes up, the doctor explained, reading over his chart. Considering the circumstances of his situation, we wanted to avoid him seeing anyone in a lab coat during his stay. 𝐒𝐿's heart clenched at the thought. She hadn't even considered it. Izuku had been experimented on, held in a lab for months and having who knows what done to him. Those bandages on his arms were just clean replacements for the ones he already had when they rescued him. The puncture wounds littering his skin were scarred over from the 2 big needles they used and how often they would pierce his skin with them before they healed properly. There was the possibility they would be permanent, and they didn't even know if they could get any needle near 𝐒𝐿 once he awoke. It was in the first hours of the morning that 𝐒𝐿 woke up. After Toshinori had left, the nurses suggested 𝐒𝐭 turned off the lights and closed the blinds, since they didn't know whether 𝐒𝐿 had been kept completely in the dark during his kidnapping. If he did, the harsh lights of the hospital and the rays of the sun could be too much for his sensitive eyes. So when 𝐒𝐿 woke up to a dark, white room, with machines beeping and tubes and wires around him, he whimpered. 𝐒𝐭 had startled at the sound, not having noticed his eyes had fluttered open. She quickly sat to be in his field of vision, but for some reason seeing her made 𝐒𝐿's face twist more into despair. 𝐒𝐿. What's wrong, baby? It's me, it's Mama. She talked to him, slow and soft as she gently held his hands in hers. 𝐒𝐿 sniffled, but no tears came from him as he tried to wriggle away from her. The weakness of his body and the pillow holding his head in place prevented him from doing much more than burrow further into the bed. 𝐒𝐿 didn't know what to do. She wanted to call a nurse or doctor but was afraid the presence of more people would send 𝐒𝐿 further into his fit, but also didn't want to move from the bed and leave him alone. His eyes were frantic as they darted this way and that, trying not to focus on her, and his monitor kept beeping faster and faster as his heart accelerated. Her son was scared, and she could only sit by his side. His heartbeat increasing must have sent an alert to the nurse's station, and a few seconds later the door opened, a nurse stepping in with worry on his face. 𝐒𝐿 closed his eyes and whined at the sudden light flooding from the hallway, and the nurse quickly shut the door behind him. Did he wake up? He asked 𝐒𝐿, carefully getting as close as he could to check 𝐒𝐿's vitals while the boy's arms trembled in an effort to bring his hands up to scrub his eyes. 𝐒𝐿 nodded, eyes unable to leave her son. I don't know what's wrong, he's shying away from me, the nurse sighed, deciding other than 𝐒�l's increased heart rate and breathing he seemed to be alright. He might be thinking he's still down there. This room is too sterile, too similar to where they got him from. I'll talk to the doctor about moving him to a pediatrics hospital. He looked at 𝐒𝐿 as he wriggled in place, head turned away from his mother. We can't confirm it yet, but he might have had hallucinations due to dehydration while captive. He might be thinking you're not real. 𝐒�'s eyes watered. Her son couldn't tell she was right there. What can we do? She whispered, almost unheard through the machines. We need to convince him that what he's seeing is real. Something that would make him understand he's no longer trapped, but what could that be? If his own mother was not enough to make him feel like he was safe from harm, what would help? 𝐒� saw her phone lying on the bedside table, and she knew. When Toshinori reached the room, the nurse on shift was waiting for him. The call he'd gotten from 𝐒� had been rushed and he almost couldn't understand what she was saying, but he finally managed to calm her down enough for her to explain 𝐒� had woken up and she needed his help. The nurse saw him arrive and sighed in relief. All Might, I'm so glad you could make it, he said, not a hint of acknowledgement to being in front of the greatest hero in the world. It always surprised Toshinori how medical staff were always so professional around him. What happened? Is young Midoriya all right? He asked, concerned. When he had given 𝐒� his phone number, he didn't expect her to call so soon. If something went wrong with the child, he would tear all for one apart limb by limb. He seems to think he's still in the lab. Thinks his mother is a hallucination and won't listen to her. We can't take the machines away or remove the four while he's in treatment, so that seems to convince him further he's still trapped, the nurse relayed to him. If it was any other person, he would have immediately removed all those stresses from the room. But as critical as 𝐒� was, they couldn't just take away all his support, least they wanted him to stop breathing. Midoriya-san seems to think seeing you there will make 𝐒� understand he's been rescued. We can't know for sure, but it's worth a try. Toshinori nodded, standing up straight. He had offered the woman her help if she ever needed it, and if this was what she needed, he would deliver. Slowly, please, the nurse said, knocking on the door 2 times before slowly pushing the door open. The first thing Toshinori heard was the frantic beeping of the machines as the boy's fear was read by them. Then he noticed the darkened room and how young Midoriya had been blocked out of sight with a blanket, which was put back down after the nurse closed the door behind him. "Sorry," 𝐿𝐭 said. "He doesn't like the light." Toshinori nodded, approaching slowly. Izuku was whining with his eyes closed, shaking in place. The hand with the four was twitching, as if the mere knowledge of the thing under his skin was setting him off. He stopped by the side of the bed, placing a hand softly on the mattress next to the boy. "Izuku," he whispered, eyes fixated on him. "Open your eyes." The new voice seemed to make Izuku still. His heartbeat went down a bit, but still faster than it should, as he opened his eyes. When his brain processed who exactly it was he was looking at, they finished opening completely, jaw slackening in a silent gasp. His vitals started going down, so suddenly 𝐭 was scared he'd pass out, but finally he stabilized, heart beating only a little faster than normal while his body stopped shaking as he gazed at the hero in front of him. Toshinori smiled softly, a tuned-down version of his hero smile, and knelt down to be at eye level with the kid. He reached to hold his hand, and almost cried when he saw it was so small he couldn't even wrap it completely around one of his fingers. Izuku's mouth opened and choked-up sounds tried to come from his throat, but it wasn't until he turned and finally saw his mother then he could speak. "Ma." 𝐭's eyes flooded with tears as she smiled, nodding at her son as he smiled weakly at her, finally understanding she was real and there with him. "Yes, Izuku." "Hi," she cried. "Mama's here." When the tiniest laugh bloomed from the child, it was as if the sun had breached through the darkness in the room. It was a group effort from half a dozen nurses to properly move Izuku with all his equipment to a room in a proper children's hospital. It was a welcome change. The floors were a navy blue tile with soft contrasting cream-colored walls, forests and animals pictured on them. Fluffy stuffed animals lined the shelves around the room next to picture books and fairy tales. Izuku was much more at place in a room like this, and he looked way more comfortable surrounded by color and warmth than in the sterile white room he'd been in before. They had brought in a low-intensity lamp. So Izuku could start getting used to the light again, and if 𝐭 barely moved from his side before, now it was impossible to get her away from her son as he cuddled against her side, her arm thrown around him as she read him a picture book she'd chosen from the shelf. He had finally gotten his bath, but had fussed until 𝐭 had been allowed to be the one doing it, and now he was squeaky clean and tired, but he refused to let his eyes close as he looked at the pictures on the pages as 𝐭 read to him. He had also been brought food a while ago, but he could only swallow a couple spoonfuls of mashed potatoes and bananas before he closed his mouth, refusing any more, and now the tray lay forgotten on the table next to them. It would be a while until his stomach could hold more food. A knock on the door interrupted 𝐭 and both Midoriyas turned in unison to look at the door as it opened to let a man inside. The man took off his hat and stopped by the door. "Midoriya-san. I'm Detective Tsukochi," he introduced himself. So this was the man Toshinori had told her would come talk to her. 𝐭 nodded at him. "Please, come in." She looked at Izuku to gauge his reaction, but only saw pure curiosity in his eyes as he followed the man who sat down on the chair next to the bed. He looked like something straight out of those old cop shows they would play on TV late at night, with his long brown coat, hat and white gloves. He strode purposefully but somehow softly at the same time, as if he was trying to show a gentler side to the kid in the room but couldn't help his years of training as an officer of the law. Izuku's eyes were fixed on him, wide and shiny as he struggled to turn his head towards him. The detective leaned forward casually, smiling at Izuku. "Hello Izuku, it's nice to meet you." Izuku blinked at him. "Tsuchi," he said, voice tiny and high-pitched. Naomasa laughed at the way the kid said his name. He was too small to pronounce it properly, but it was a cute nickname. "That means Earth, did you know?" "No," Izuku said in lieu of shaking his head. Seemed he had an easier time speaking than moving after he'd gotten the appropriate hydration and with the help of a few healing quirks of the medical staff. "Izuku, the detective would like to talk to us, would that be all right?" 𝐭 asked him, and Naomasa was surprised at how she spoke to him, softly but to the point, not a single baby word or funny sound. Izuku looked for a moment, considering, and then hummed in assent. Naomasa had worked with kids plenty of times, but Izuku had to be the youngest he'd ever have to deal with, and also the situation was really delicate, Toshinori had told him of the freak-out Izuku had had the night before, and he had to be careful to not say anything that would trigger the kid into another panic attack. "Do you like heroes, Izuku?" he asked, remembering how Toshinori told him he'd calmed down at the sight of him. Izuku smiled brightly through his oxygen mask. Yes. He was so excited at the mention of heroes, he had to take a second to breathe deeply after the single word. "All Might. Is he your favorite?" 𝐒𝐭𝐚𝐲 asked. He leaned in to whisper to him, playing it up like some big secret just between them. "You know, he's a good friend of mine. He helps me a lot catching bad guys." "He punches," Izuku said, closing and opening his fists. "Smash." "He sure likes smashing," 𝐒𝐭𝐚𝐲 agreed. Then turned a bit more serious. "Tell me, Izuku, you've seen All Might catch bad guys, right?" Izuku stilled for a second, eyes glazing over in a faraway look. He hummed. "Can you remember how he did it? What moves he used? Like how we watch those hero fights on TV, remember?" 𝐿𝐴𝐼𝐸 jumped in, rubbing her thumb over Izuku's hand. He looked up at her, smiling a little. "We like to narrate the fights as if we were there, right?" "Yes, the moves," Izuku giggled, looking happier. "All Might jumped," he started, and 𝐒𝐭𝐚𝐲 leaned forward even more, listening carefully. "Really fast. Then, it shook the ground." 𝐿𝐴𝐸 beat him to the punch, knowing exactly what Izuku was saying but choosing to help 𝐒𝐭𝐚𝐲 understand him better instead of just telling him afterwards. Izuku smiled. "The ground," he continued. Then, door was open, and he went silent and stood still. They didn't hurry him, waiting for him to find his voice again. It was less than a minute, but it sure felt longer. "And he ran." "Who is he, Izuku?" "All Might." 𝐒𝐭𝐚𝐲 asked him. If he had taken the time to think it over, then this part was important. Izuku frowned. No. The man was he talking about All for One? He'd have to confirm with Toshinori later. Saw his hand. Then gone. Then All Might was there. "And I fell asleep." 𝐒𝐭𝐚𝐲 met eyes with 𝐿𝐴𝐸, then continued. "Did you see that man a lot?" "No," Izuku said. "Others?" "In a chair. Arms hurt," he whimpered, looking down at his bandaged arms. Red, he looked meaningfully at the 4-line administering fluid to him, apprehension on his eyes. He seemed to be fine enough with it as long as he didn't see the needle, but the force still made him uneasy. Red. Were they taking BLD from him? 𝐒𝐭𝐚𝐲 had seen his medical file. Izuku had dozens of puncture wounds on his arms, too big to be from injections. Almost as if they were trying to harvest something from him. But what would they want with his BLD? And Izuku started on his own. And he choked up, skiing in a shaky breath even though no tears appeared on his eyes. 𝐒𝐴𝐚𝐲 stood up, alarmed that he triggered a bad memory on the child and ready to call a nurse if needed. 𝐿𝐴𝐸 held Izuku's hand, petting his hair and hugging him as best as she could. He said, his mouth twisted in sorrow, completely out of place in a child so young. "Quirk." "No quirk, he didn't have a quirk." 𝐒𝐴𝐚𝐲 asked, confused. Why would one of the villains talk about not having a quirk? "No," Izuku cried out. He was looking directly at his own feet. 𝐿𝐴𝐸 looked at 𝐒𝐽𝐚𝐲, then at her son. "Izuku, what do you mean no quirk?" He said, Izuku swallowed, throat closing. "My toes." 𝐒𝐽𝐚𝐲 knew now what he meant. "You have a double joint." Izuku started. Sniffing, but no further sound made it out. His eyes watered, but he didn't start crying. That worried 𝐒𝐽𝐚𝐲 and even more 𝐿𝐴𝐸. A child that age should be crying his little heart out over something so upsetting, and even more when 𝐿𝐴𝐸 knew Izuku was as prone to crying as she was. Once they'd both started wailing just because a neighbor brought them a cake to thank 𝐿𝐴𝐸 for helping get her cat down from a tree with her quirk. Why wasn't he crying? "I think that's enough for today," 𝐒𝐽𝐚𝐲 said, standing up. He looked for something in his pockets. "Midoriya-san, here's my card. I'd like to talk to you once Izuku gets discharged. I think it's be better to talk further about this once you're comfortable back home." 𝐿𝐴𝐸 nodded, grabbing the card with one hand. It was a bit rude, but her other hand was hugging her son and she wasn't going to let go of him anytime soon. "Thank you, detective. I'll call you once we're out of here." Izuku was still sniffling, eyes still looking at his feet. 𝐒𝐬𝐽𝐾, 𝐒𝐬𝐚 said. 𝐒𝐬𝐽 looked up at him, still a bit out of it. It was really nice to meet you. 𝐒𝐬𝐽 blinked at him, and then smiled a little. Bye-bye Tsuchi. 𝐒𝐬𝐚 grinned at him, putting on his hat and tipping it at him. Bye-bye, Zuku. When 𝐒𝐬𝐚 left the room, his smile vanished. What had they done to that kid? After the conversation 𝐒𝐬𝐽 had with the detective, 𝐒𝐭 talked with the doctor about what 𝐒𝐬𝐽 had said about being quirkless, and a new doctor with an X-ray scan quirk was brought in so they didn't have to move him around too much. The doctor introduced himself to 𝐒𝐬𝐽 and made small talk with him from the foot of the bed, casually getting his job done while distracting the child. He jotted down his findings on 𝐒𝐽's chart and then subtly handed it over to 𝐒𝐭. 𝐒𝐽 did indeed have a double joint on each pinky toe. Clinically, he was quirkless. 𝐒𝐭 held her son close to her chest and hummed a made-up song until he fell asleep. A week later, when 𝐒𝐽 had regained enough strength to sit on his own and no longer needed the oxygen mask, he'd been discharged from the hospital. 𝐒𝐭 had been given instructions on the special diet he would need to follow and a series of exercises to recover muscular mass. 𝐒𝐽 would still need intravenous fluids while at home since he couldn't hold both food and water at the same time, and could only eat so much each day. He'd gathered enough strength to move his head around, but still used the pillow as it tired him too much to hold it upright all the time, and he could raise his hands up to his face easily enough. He'd also been mostly able to sleep peacefully through the nights, with how tired the recovery made him and how some of his meds had that little side effect, but a couple of times he had woken up screaming, looking around frantically for his mother and holding on to her for dear life as he refused to look around the darkness of the room. He had been such a good patient, all the staff was both sad and glad to see him go, because they'd grown attached to him but also because it meant he was recovering and, frankly, they hoped to never see him again at the hospital if possible. They had gotten 𝐒𝐽 a little surprise before he left, though, a special visit from Recovery Girl herself. The heroine had known of 𝐒𝐽's case, but had been unable to help him as her quirk drained the patient's energy and 𝐒𝐽 didn't have any to begin with. Even now if she used it would probably send 𝐒𝐽 to square one regarding his physical therapy. 𝐒𝐽 had been ecstatic no less, happy to see another real hero. I've heard a lot about you, 𝐒𝐿. They tell me you've been a good boy. She asked him, walking beside him as 𝐿𝐭 wheeled him down the halls towards the entrance. Her white coat was bundled up and tied around her cane. 𝐒𝐿 nodded, smile blinding as he kicked his feet in excitement. I've been good, he said. Are you going to heal me too? I'm afraid not, dearie. She shook her head, patting 𝐒𝐿's hand. My quirk would not help you right now, but you seem to be doing more than okay on your own. 𝐒𝐿 looked sad for a moment that he wouldn't be able to receive one of her healing kisses, but he brightened up nearly instantly. I can eat now, a whole bowl. She laughed heartily, nodding her head in approval. That's wonderful, 𝐒𝐿. I know you'll be just fine. They had been assigned an officer named 𝐒𝐿𝐵 as SCRT for their trip back home, a cop with a cat head that Detective Tsukochi himself had recommended. They were picked up by a van specially chosen for it incorporated lift so 𝐒𝐿 wouldn't have to be picked up from his wheelchair and then put back down over and over. Only when they reached the apartment complex did 𝐿𝐿 pick him up to walk upstairs while Officer 𝐒𝐿𝐵 carried the wheelchair behind her. 𝐒𝐿 stared at the cat-headed officer over his mother's shoulder, eyes shining in joy as 𝐒𝐿𝐵 made funny faces at him. Outside their apartment stood another officer, this one with a dog head, and 𝐿𝐿 didn't know if it was just a thing for police officers to have animal characteristics or if they were chosen specifically because their appearances would put 𝐒𝐿 more at ease, who told her he'd personally made sure the place was safe and they could go in without worrying. We've also set patrols around the block, woof, the officer said. 𝐒𝐿 looked at him in wonder and stretched a hand forward. To 𝐿�'s surprise, the officer chuckled and leaned down, letting 𝐒� pat the top of his head a couple of times until the boy was happy with it. Hope you're happy to be home, pup doggy, 𝐒� breathed out, still starstruck. 𝐿� stiff-led a laugh and turned the handle, opening the door wide and letting Officer 𝐒𝐿𝐵 walk in first to set the wheelchair down for her to sit 𝐒� on it. 𝐒� looked around, as if in disbelief he was actually back home. His arms were too weak to wheel himself around, even if the chair was appropriate for his size, so he had to wait until 𝐿� thanked the officers and closed the door so she could move him through the apartment. What do you want to do first, baby? She asked him, crouching. in front of him so he wouldn't strain his neck looking for her. Izuku looked around the room. Can I go to my room? Of course you can, sweetie, you don't need to ask, she smiled at him, standing up and kissing the top of his head as she took him there. She stopped in the middle of the room to let him decide what to do next. Izuku stared at his room in silence, as if trying to make sure it was how he remembered it. There was his bed with the soft green blanket his grandma had gifted him when he was born, his toys tidily stored away in the see-through box in the corner, right where he'd left them. There were a couple of posters of All Might hanging on the wall next to his crayon drawings. Everything was well kept and clean, spotless despite his absence. 𝐒𝐭 stared at him like a hawk, ready to step in the moment he showed the first signs of distress to comfort him and hold him tightly in her arms. She waited and waited, hands twisting the edge of her sweater. Izuku finally looked at her, face not betraying his thoughts at all. It unnerved 𝐒𝐭 to see that kind of look on her little son. "TV. Please," he said, softly, like trying not to disturb the order in the room. 𝐒𝐭 felt her heart clench. He was so calm. "Wise, of course, honey," she stammered, turning him around and leading him to the living room. "Do you want to sit on the couch, or would you rather stay in the chair?" Izuku hummed. "Couch." Softer, he said, voice way tinier than it had been that morning. 𝐒𝐭 was getting worried now. Izuku had been scheduled for psychological therapy as well, but they still hadn't had the first appointment. She was worried Izuku was having trouble processing his return home, and most of all it bothered her how subdued he was acting. Any other time Izuku would have cheered and maybe cried in joy at being back home after so long, like that one time they spent 2 weeks in Hokkaido to visit 𝐒𝐭's parents. She carefully lifted him up and set him down in the middle of the couch, setting pillows around him in case he lost balance and fell sideways. "Are you cold? I can get you your blanket." He shook his head and said nothing more. 𝐒𝐭 stood there a moment, awkwardly looking at him before snapping back to the present and turning on the TV, tuning it to the local hero network that Izuku liked to watch before bed. She sighed relieved when his eyes brightened up at the sight of the heroes on screen, a show listing off new debutantes and their quirks. "Izuku, I'll be right here in the kitchen, alright? Call me if you need anything," she said, pointing to the open kitchen right behind the couch. She was a bit nervous at leaving his sight, but she wanted to check the pantry and fridge to see what she was missing for Izuku's diet. Izuku's eyes widened a bit, mouth opening just enough to be noticeable, and he tried to turn around and see the kitchen, but he couldn't move that far, and besides the back of the couch reached way above his head. He looked conflicted and his lower lip started trembling, but he just settled and looked down at his hands. "Kay," he said, voice quivering slightly. 𝐒𝐭's heart broke. "Would you like to sit in your high chair instead? You wouldn't be able to see the TV that well, but you can be with me in the kitchen." Izuku seemed to consider the idea before nodding, raising his arms in the ancient up gesture. 𝐒𝐭 smiled relieved and picked him up, carrying him with her and setting him up where they both could see each other all the time. It would be a bit of an extra effort to make sure Izuku was comfortable at home once more, but she would go far and beyond for him. Toshinori had been with Naomasa in his office when he got the call. "Hello, Chief," he answered. He had gone silent while Tsuragami spoke on the other side of the line, and whatever he'd said had turned Naomisa's face from casual and professional to shocked, then angry as Toshinori had never seen him. "I understand, sir. I'll see to it immediately." "Yes, I'll bring him with me." He ended the call and looked at Toshinori, the furious gleam still in his eyes. "Is something wrong?" Toshinori asked. "I can leave if you're busy." "You're leaving indeed," Naomasa interrupted him, snatching his coat and hat from the hanger and swiftly putting them on. "With me, right now." He marched out of the door, Toshinori scrambling to follow after him. He didn't even manage to ask what happened again when Naomasa turned around. The Midoriya residence had a break-in. Toshinori stilled his steps, then redoubled them as he hurried to follow Naomasa out of the station. "Are they all right? Did they catch the perp?" The hero on patrol managed to catch them soon after they broke the door down, he explained as they got into the car. They tried to attack Midoriya-san, but she managed to keep them away with the use of her quirk, long enough for the hero to jump in and make the arrest. He turned on the siren, driving off as fast as he could. "What about young Midoriya, Izuku?" Toshinori asked, worried about the boy being under attack so soon after leaving the hospital. "He's fine. He was in his room so they couldn't reach him, he said. He got woken up by the noise, so he might be startled still. It's one of the reasons I brought you. He calms down faster around you. Toshinori pursed his lips, looking ahead towards the road. The cars were thankfully enough clearing the way for them to pass. That can't be all. He should be comfortable enough with just his mother already. What other reason is there? A second passed in silence, then Naomasa sighed. Tsuragami has suspicions the break-in might have been work of one of All for One's minions. Toshinori stared at him, wide-eyed and mouth agape, then clenched his teeth in fury. Even from Tartarus. How low do you have to be to want a kid hurt so much? Naomasa pursed his lips, finally seeing the apartment complex around the corner. He turned off the siren and parked by the other police cars. Villains, Toshi. They are heartless. They got out and rushed upstairs as fast as they could, Officer Sangza saluting them as he let them through into the apartment. The place was a mess, picture frames and potted plants broken to pieces and scattered across the floor, decorative statuettes stuck in the walls and furniture toppled over. It got worse the further they went into the house. Plates and glasses turned to sharp shards in the kitchen, the TV on the floor by the dining table, and some drops of BLD staining the carpet, leading to a considerable spot that, luckily, didn't manage to be big enough to be a puddle. Tsuragami popped his head from a room at the back, gesturing for them to come over. It was clear on sight that it was Izuku's room, the bright colors and Toshinori stored in the back of his mind, All Might posters decorating the room, marking it as a child's territory. Said child was cuddled up in his mother's lap, hidden from view as she wrapped her arms tight around his trembling form on the bed. Inko's eyes screamed bloody murder as she stared at the wall, rocking her son carefully in her arms as she whispered to him, soft words clashing with the thunderous expression on her face. She was spotless, and a shiver ran down Toshinori's back when he realized that BLD out there was most likely all the villains. Midoriya-san. Naomasa walked in, Toshinori hot on his heels. Are you alright? We're fine, she answered curtly, then closed her eyes and took a deep breath, letting it out slowly. Her face twisted in grief as she held Izuku closer to her. We're fine. She turned to look at them and seemed to just now realize Toshinori was there. She looked down at Izuku and nuzzled against his hair, nodding at the hero to come closer. Izuku, he said, having a flashback to their meeting that night at the hospital. The situation was similar, but also so different. Izuku peeked over his mother's arm, still trembling in fear but maintaining eye contact all the same. Toshinori knelt in front of them, mother and son fixing their green eyes on him so intensely, he felt they were looking right through him. This time, Toshinori thought, it wasn't just about reassuring Izuku. He reached for Inko's hand, slowly pulling it away from Izuku but keeping it in his hold. The child's breathing started picking up at part of his shield being taken away, but All Might brought his other hand up to replace it, carefully laying his palm on the boy. His hand was big enough to cover him completely, and its warmth as it rubbed his back helped calm down Izuku enough that he turned around slightly in his mother's hold to look better at the hero. Inko's breathing seemed to be turning deeper as well, her hand clutching Toshinori's as her gaze drifted between him and her son. The adrenaline of fighting off the intruder was wearing off fast and she was left shaking, a cold sweat covering her from head to toe. She found comfort in the gentle blue eyes staring at her, reassuring her that they were safe. Everything's all right now, he said, softly and letting a small smile cross his face. And you know why? Izuku hugged his mother's arm, lips twitching a bit. Because you're here, because I'm here, Toshinori grinned. And your mother as well, such a brave woman, isn't she? Inko flushed as Izuku nodded, his little smile warming her up. Naomasa cleared his throat, stepping closer but keeping his distance. The three of them seemed to have formed a little bubble of comfort that he didn't want to accidentally burst. Midoriya-san, I think it would be better if you came with us to the station for the night, he glanced down at Izuku. Both of you, Inko shivered at the thought of leaving the room. Says that man. The perpetrator has been detained. He's currently on the way to a local jail to await for trial some ways away from here. Tsuragami spoke from the corner of the room. He'd observed patiently as the hero calmed down the little family. The hero on patrol who caught him will be waiting for us at the station to get the full story for Detective Tsukochi. Woof, she nodded, taking a deep breath once again to ground herself. She leaned down to talk to her son. Izuku, do you remember Detective Tsukochi? Tsuchi Izuku whispered, looking at said man. Toshinori covered his laugh with a cough at the nickname. So cute. That's right, 𝐒𝐭 nodded. We'll be going with Tsuchi, alright? Izuku whined, turning around to bury his face on his mother's chest, holding onto her with all the strength he could muster. 𝐒𝐭 carefully extracted her hand from Toshinori's hold and ran it through the boy's hair. She stood up slowly, letting the hero keep his hand on Izuku's back as she followed the detective outside, Tsuragami closing ranks behind them. She was so focused on holding Izuku tightly against her, she didn't remember his wheelchair until they were halfway through the station, but Naomasa assured her they had a few spare in the office they could use, so they wouldn't be cumbered with it later on. While all the sudden energy drained from 𝐒𝐭 and left her feeling cold and shaky, it had the effect of putting Izuku to sleep, his face hidden in 𝐒𝐭's neck as his breathing evened. When they arrived, both 𝐒𝐭 and Toshinori were equally surprised to see the police station crawling with heroes, strategically positioned all over the place to cover any blind spots the building could have, some outside the gate, some in the lobby, others crouched on the roof on the lookout. Splashes of colorful suits and flashy quirks that had 𝐒𝐭 on the brink of waking Izuku up so he could see them. She of course decided his sleep was more important, and sat back quietly as Naomasa showed his ID to the officer watching the gates. Tsukochi, what's this all about? Toshinori asked him, getting out of the car after the detective and hurrying to open the door for 𝐒𝐭, helping her out and watching close behind her like a protective shadow. It's a security measure, Naomasa answered. If Tsuragami is right and that villain was one of All for One's minions, there's no telling how many there are prowling around. We called all the heroes that were off duty for the night to keep the precinct and the Midoriyas safe from any more attacks. He looked around at the dozens of heroes patrolling around the building, some new to the job, some well known to the public. Somehow I feel like we'd need even more once inside the building. Naomasa brought them straight to his office, closing the door and hurrying to the little closet he used to hang his coat and extra changes of clothing in, and pulled down a box from the shelf on top. He started pulling blankets and a couple of pillows from it, quickly setting them down on the couch. Every once in a while I get so caught up in work I spend the night here, so I tend to keep some stuff to be more comfortable when I do, he explained, making sure it looked comfortable enough. You can set down Izuku in here, or lie down as well if you wish. Midoriya-san. 𝐒𝐭 nodded, a shaky but grateful smile on her face as she sat down and set Izuku down beside her, making sure he was comfortable on the pillows and warm under the covers. She felt another blanket be placed carefully over her lap, and she turned just in time to see Toshinori draping another one over her shoulders, covering her completely in a soft, warm cocoon. You looked cold, he explained. Also a bit pale. Would you like something warm? I know Tsukochi keeps hot chocolate hidden in the kitchen. He winked conspirationally at her, and 𝐒𝐿 had to cover her mouth to stifle a giggle. She nodded nonetheless, watching him leave the room as Naomasa followed him with his eyes, a deadpan look on his face at the clear theft of his treats. He would have offered them anyway. I want you to remember that, the symbol of peace steals my chocolate, he said, and smiled at the actual laugh it got from her. He sat down on his chair and looked over the report that had been left on his desk. Pressing the intercom on his phone, he called for the hero on patrol to come in. A moment later there was a knock on the door and a new person walked in, wearing a hero suit so scandalous 𝐒𝐭 felt the need to cover Izuku's eyes despite him being deep asleep. Hello, the heroine smiled wide at them. My name's Midnight, I'm a third-year student at UA. I was assigned to patrol your home tonight. Midnight is a hero in training with a provisional license, Naomasa explained, rummaging through his drawers until he pulled something out and threw it at the heroine. She caught it and pouted at him, holding it at arm's length. There's a child present, Nemurai. Just humor me please, the teenager huffed but complied, tugging on what 𝐒𝐭 now recognized as an oversized sweater that reached her mid-thigh. You're no fun, Midnight, could you recount the events of tonight? Just to verify everything's all right in the report, Naomasa asked, shuffling through the pages. She nodded, sitting down on the chair in front of Naomasa's desk, turning it to face both he and 𝐒𝐿. I was finishing doing a quick check around the block when I heard something being slammed. I ran as fast as I could towards the building and up to the apartment. The door was broken to pieces and there was shouting coming from inside. When I made it in, there was a man all dressed up in black with a ski mask on like those cliché thieves from American movies, she huffed, crossing her arms. Midoriya-san was using her quirk to keep him at bay, walking backwards into the kitchen so the villain was in between her and the objects she wanted to pull towards herself. Very smart move on her part, I must say, 𝐒𝐭 flushed, bringing a hand to her face. It was just motherly instinct, really. Regardless, I know pro heroes that can't think past their muscles. You have a good head on your shoulders, she nodded emphatically. When the villain tried to lunge at her, she started using the shards of the broken pots and glass around the lobby and the dishes from the kitchen to try to knock him out. All that happened in the couple of seconds it took me to get to them. Mind you, he seemed really desperate to reach them. I used my quirk and put him to sleep as soon as I arrived, and then notified Chief Tsuragami of the break-in. Naomasa nodded, setting the files aside. Everything seems to be in order. Did you manage to get some information from the villain before he was taken away? Midnight frowned. Once I had him cuffed and he woke up, he seemed to be very scared. He kept saying how he was gonna kill him and how he had to get out of there. Chief Tsuragami thought he might be referring to the villain that kidnapped 𝐒𝐿, since the attack was so soon after the rescue. Naomasa hummed, resting his chin on his hands. We might need to put extra protection to his cell as well then, if we want more answers. Right then the door opened again, Toshinori walking in carrying a tray with a few steaming cups. Ah, young Midnight, I was told you would be here, he said, handing her one of the cups. Midnight grinned at him, glee on her face at the presence of the hero. Thank you, sir, how considerate, she winked at him, and Naomasa threw a balled-up paper at the back of her head. Oh! He's like thrice your age, keep it down. As Namurai pouted at the man, Toshinori set down a cup on Naomisa's desk and then took the rest to the couch, sitting down next to 𝐒𝐭 and offering her the biggest one. Sorry it took so long, I'm a bit useless in the kitchen, he said bashfully, rubbing the back of his head. 𝐒𝐭 took it with a grateful smile, and noticed there were 2 left on the tray. Did you make one for Izuku too? Ah, yes, he said. In case he woke up while I was gone, didn't want the little one to feel left out. I know he can keep down more food now, so. Nah, that's so sweet. Midnight brought a hand to her chest. You'd be such a good dad, All Might. Toshinori blushed, coughing into his fist. 𝐒𝐭 smiled, picking up the cup for Izuku. Thank you, I'm sure he'll appreciate it. She knew the sweet smell of chocolate would eventually rouse Izuku from sleep, and sure enough the boy was shuffling under the blankets, nose twitching like a little bunny's. Mema, he said, and Midnight squealed in delight at his tiny voice. 𝐒𝐭 leaned down carefully and kissed his forehead, fixing his pillows so he could be sitting up comfortably. How are you feeling, honey? Tired, he mumbled, rubbing his eye with a chubby fist. Chocolate? He asked, still sniffing around while his eyes fought to stay open. Midnight was going to die, right there. Hi sweetie, she said softly while 𝐒𝐭 helped Izuku take a sip of the drink. Izuku looked at her over the rim of the cup, blinking curiously at the new person. My name's Namurai, but you can call me Midnight, nice to meet you. Izuku pushed the cup away, a chocolate mustache left on his lip. You're a hero? He asked, momentary joy making him forget all previous events of the night. In training, Midnight nodded, standing up to crouch in front of him. I'll be a hero by the end of the year. I hope you'll be cheering me on, she said, winking at him and sticking her tongue out in a funny face, thumbs up as well. Izuku laughed in response, clapping in excitement at meeting a new hero. It felt like the hearts of everyone in the room melted at the same time. Naomasa looked over the scene with a smile, glad that Izuku had been pulled out of his latest scare at least. His smile dimmed as he remembered he still had some questions to ask 𝐒𝐭 that he'd chosen to wait until they were home to discuss. He just didn't expect they'd be attacked the same night Izuku was discharged. Midoriya-san, he started, getting the attention of the woman as Midnight distracted Izuku with stories from her patrols. If it were possible, I'd like to discuss some more things with you. He glanced meaningfully at Izuku. Important things. 𝐒𝐭's face fell, worry etching her features as she looked at her son, still being entertained by Midnight. She understood Tsukochi wanted to discuss things that could be harmful for Izuku to overhear, but she didn't want her baby away from her after tonight, not out of her sight where she couldn't be there for him if he got scared again. A hand fell on her shoulder, and her eyes found Toshinori's as she turned around. I could take care of him for a few minutes, he offered, smiling reassuringly. I'd be sure to bring him back to you at the minor sign of him being uncomfortable, of course, but… he rubbed the back of his neck, looking away bashfully. He seems to be fine around me, so I thought. 𝐒𝐭 bit her lip, eyes falling to her lap as she fell deep in thought. I know he is, she let out a little laugh, brushing a strand of hair from her face. You're his favorite hero. She turned towards Izuku, petting his hair softly to get his attention. He looked up at her, eyes bright and chocolate stash twisting up along his smile. Honey, would you be all right being with All Might for a while? She asked him while cleaning his face with a swipe of her thumb. His eyes widened, shining in awe at the idea. 𝐒𝐭 decided to drop the other shoe. You'd be away from Mama for a while though. His face fell, fear slipping in his expression as the idea processed through his sharp mind. He started shaking his head, fists coming up to clench on his mom's skirt. Toshinori stood up, Midnight moving aside to let him take her place in front of Izuku, his face capturing the boy's attention back to him. Izuku, it's alright, he said, voice soft and soothing. Toshinori found he didn't really know where this careful way he had with the child came from. He'd never really interacted with kids before, other than kissing babies when he was stopped for interviews or after a fight with a lot of public. It was as if there was something about this kid pulling him in. You haven't seen them yet, but there are a lot of heroes here right now. Don't you want to go out there and meet them? I will be with you the whole time, and I'll make personally sure you are safe and comfortable, okay? Izuku looked conflicted, torn between wanting to stay within the safety and comfort his mother's arms provided, and taking the chance to spend time with his favorite hero, the one who could beat any villain and save everyone with a smile. The one who rescued him. Izuku, face still twisted in uncertainty, raised his arms to be picked up. Toshinori smiled brightly at him, picking him up carefully, and rejoicing internally at how much heavier he already felt compared to a week ago. He still was as light as a feather for All Might, but the difference was telling nonetheless. 𝐒𝐭 stood up, blanket sliding off of her and the two mugs in her hands left behind on the little side table, and held Izuku's hands in hers, leaning in to kiss his cheeks over and over again. You're so brave, baby, she cooed. I'll be back with you as soon as I can, I promise. She held out her pinky, the most sacred promising tradition to a child like Izuku. He reached out and linked his pinky with hers, and 𝐒𝐭 shook it up and down while promising to be as quick as possible, Izuku's frown turning into a little smile while Toshinori chuckled at the duo. Midnight leaned against Naomisa's desk, arms crossed as she watched the scene unfolding before them. Am I the only one thinking they look straight out of a Christmas greetings card? She whispered to the detective, getting a snort and a tap on the arm where he could reach. Stop it, Naomisa said, grinning nonetheless. His eyes traveled to the trio in the middle of the room, and he couldn't help thinking they did look kind of adorable like that, even if Toshinori absolutely dwarfed the other two. It kind of added to the charm, actually. Midnight winked at him, then pushed herself off the desk. Izuku, I'll go with you as well. She called out to the boy, smiling at him as he stared straight at her before nodding silently. Toshinori walked leisurely out of the room, allowing Izuku to keep his mother on sight until the last second over his shoulder, and then the door closed behind them. 𝐒𝐭 sighed shakily and sat back down on the couch, grabbing one of the pillows and hugging it to her chest, the warmth and soft scent left behind by Izuku comforting her. Naomisa winced sympathetically. It wasn't as obvious since 𝐒𝐭 was an adult and Izuku just a little child, but she was just as affected by being separated from her son as he was. Maybe even more. He couldn't even begin to imagine how it must felt to let him out of her sight for even a few minutes when she just got him back. During those 4 long months, 𝐒𝐭 had deteriorated at an incredible speed. She couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't work or do anything without feeling horribly guilty. She couldn't forgive herself for every single second she wasn't trying to find Izuku. The deep bags under her eyes that had been ever present the past weeks had gotten better with what little sleep and relief she'd gotten this past week, but they were still visible and Naomisa had the feeling they might very well be permanent. Now, Midoriya-san, Naomisa started. I need to get some questions out of the way, if that's all right with you. 𝐒𝐭 sighed, nodding and rubbing her eyes with the heel of her hands. Of course. I'd just like to get this done as fast as possible, please. Naomisa nodded, picking up a pen and notebook. First of all, may I inquire about Izuku's father? Out of nowhere, Inko's face turned distant, a mix of harshness and sadness swirling together in her eyes. Ah, Hisoshi, she said softly. She picked up her abandoned cup of chocolate and took a long, comforting gulp of it. Naomasa didn't hurry her. It made him glad to see her enjoying a treat for once, even if it was just to steel herself for what seemed like an uncomfortable subject. She set the cup on her lap. We got married too fast, too young. He wanted to make it far in the entertainment industry, and so he jumped at the chance when he got offered a job in a big American network. How long ago was this? Naomasa asked. Inko laughed humorlessly. 2 years ago, more or less. She looked down at her hands, a sour smile on her face. It was really unfitting on her. Naomasa did the math in less than a second. But that's Izuku's age. Yes, she nodded, rubbing her forehead in exhaustion. I got the news I was pregnant a few weeks after Hisoshi accepted the job. I was supposed to go with him, but when I told him... She trailed off. We never really talked about it, but Hisoshi didn't want to have children. He was too career-oriented and didn't want any distractions. She looked up, hard eyes setting on Naomasa's shocked ones. I told him if that was the case, then he wouldn't need me there distracting him either. Naomasa felt a chill go down his spine. We fought about it for a long time, until the time came that he had to leave. She leaned back against the back of the couch, taking another sip of her drink. I decided to stay and have my baby, and he said he couldn't deal with so much while working on his future. I said that was fair. If he didn't want to be a father, he didn't have to. She shrugged. So we got divorced and he left. I stayed here and had Izuku, raised him myself as best as I could. Hisoshi at least acknowledged that he was a responsible part in the process, and sends me a check every month to help take care of Izuku. They have never met, and never will, and we're fine like that. Naomasa jotted everything down, making some notes on the side to try and find as much info about this man as he could, try to contact him if possible. Even if he was not related to the case, the kidnapping and rescue had made national news and there was a chance he'd known about it. It was just a routine thing, to discard every possible person related. Every BLD relation of Izuku would be investigated as well, but the father was the only one no one had any information about. Do you think he could have been knowledgeable about Izuku's kidnapping? He asked her. I didn't tell him, and I haven't heard from him in years, so I don't think so, she said, frowning and staring out the window at the starry sky. I honestly don't think he has anything to do with this. He's very self-centered, but he's no villain. Naomasa nodded, finishing up his notes and jumping to the next question, eager to get Midoriya-san's mind away from these memories. Izuku held on tight to All Might's arms around him, hiding his face in his chest as the hero walked through the building. Midnight walked next to him, chatting his ear off about everything and anything she could think of to fill the silence around Izuku. The boy was nervous about being away from his mother, even while warm and safe in the greatest hero's arms. He couldn't help his body shaking with every step they took, knowing he was farther and farther away from her by the second. Izuku, it's all right, Toshinori soothed him, rubbing his back softly. I swear, nothing bad will happen. Me and young Nemuri will be here for you every second. He leaned away to look the boy in the eyes. They were wide and scared, looking up at him with the same fear he usually saw on people he rescued from disaster zones. Look around you. Izuku's lips quivered, a whine sprouting from them as he dove in to bury his face back into the hero's front, clutching at his shirt. Toshinori had stopped walking, and Midnight was no longer speaking, so the silence was deafening around them. Truth was, it was all the BLD rushing to Izuku's ears and blocking out the outside world. As the seconds passed and his heart evened out, small sounds started making his way to him. The first one was the chirping of crickets. Soft grass rustled by the wind. Careful steps of people around them. The silence of a city deep asleep. Izuku turned around slightly, a single green eye visible as he inspected his surroundings. The concrete wall separating the precinct from the outside world was within sight, and on the other side he could see people marching by, looking around in high alert. They wore colorful costumes dimmed by the yellow lights of the streetlights shining down on them. He turned around the other way. The precinct was behind them, the officers inside hard at work writing away and talking on the phone endlessly. He looked down. A garden. How long has it been since you were outside, 𝐒𝐿? Midnight asked softly, leaning against Toshinori to get a closer look at the child's face. Izuku remained silent. Toshinori sat down on the grass, setting Izuku down in the cradle of his legs as he spun the boy to face away from him. Izuku's eyes locked on the grass below, the blades a dark green in the night. Izuku couldn't help thinking they looked like his hair. Like his mom's too. He leaned down a bit, Toshinori's hands holding him to prevent him from just falling on his face. His tiny hand reached out hesitantly, stopping mere millimeters away from the ground. He could hear Midnight slowly kneeling down next to him, and he felt a boost of confidence at knowing he was surrounded by people he just felt he could trust, and finally planted his hand flat against the grass. It was soft and cold, just the slightest bit dewy as it tickled his palm as it moved around in small circles, letting the blades brush between his fingers. Forgetting his own position, he put his other hand down as well, making Toshinori scramble to hold him properly as Izuku was now pretty much hovering just above the ground. He didn't realize he'd nearly forgotten how grass felt like. Cold, he giggled, mushing his hands against the grass in bigger circles, even tearing out a bunch of it and throwing it up in the air, letting it rain down on him. The sound caught the attention of the heroes patrolling around the area, and a few walked closer to take a look at him as he played in the garden. One in particular with a cowboy hat and what looked like a metal gas mask chuckled at the boy's antics. Izuku stopped and looked up, eyes widening at the sight of the array of heroes waving at him from a safe distance. The clashing colors of their suits and physical manifestation of some quirks had his little head spinning as he looked at one after another, just now realizing how many of them were there. He gasped, clapping his hands together and then bringing them to cover his gaping mouth. "Do you wanna say hi?" Midnight asked him, leaning into his field of vision with a wide grin on her face. Izuku nodded immediately and raised his arms, making Nemurai squeal in joy at the boy asking her to hold him so readily. She snatched him up from Toshinori's arms faster than the hero could blink, and brought him over to the concrete wall so he could sit there. Izuku spent what felt like forever just asking and asking, from names to quirks to their favorite food and color. There was no end to his thirst for knowledge, and these heroes were more than happy to fill him with it. They would go to him two at a time, the others keeping up watch from their strategic positions while Izuku was out in the open. All of them plus All Might standing right behind him with Midnight, large hand once again covering the kid's back providing warmth and protection, was more than enough to make him feel so safe he completely forgot about his fear of being outside. It wasn't until a blanket was gently wrapped around his shoulders that he startled out of his hero frenzy, turning around to see the smiling face of his mother looking at him. He immediately forgot all about the heroes around him, and shuffled to turn around and meet her halfway as she wrapped her arms around him, shifting the blanket into a tight cocoon guarding him from the night air. He hid his face against her neck and let her familiar scent soothe him. "Did you have fun, baby?" She asked him softly, turning around and walking inside once more, nodding at the heroes as they drifted off back to their work. Izuku hummed, suddenly feeling tired all over again as the safety and warmth of 𝐒𝐭𝐻 lulled him to sleep. His hands clenched on her sweater as she made a little hood with the blanket to cover his head with, protecting him from the chilly night air. It had been less than an hour that they'd been separated, but it had been more than they'd been since the rescue. 𝐒𝐭𝐻 knew that they couldn't keep clinging to each other forever, and that Izuku would have to get used once more to not have her on his sights all the time, but he was still young and she could relish on having him securely held against her chest for as long as she wanted. Suddenly worry filled her as she walked through the doors and back into the station. Her talk with Tsukochi had been very normal for police standards, just him asking her about people close to them and different situations she thought could provide danger to Izuku and herself. He just wanted to discard any possible threat now that there was a chance of All for One to be after them even behind bars. When they were done, he'd remained quiet for a minute, reading over his notes as she sipped at her now cold drink. Then he looked up and spoke. "Midoriya-san, what would you say about being part of a witness protection program?" 𝐒𝐿 had never thought in her life she'd hear those words directed at her. The detective had given her the rundown of the matter. If this villain had so many lackeys around, then there was a high chance of them not being safe anywhere. Not even changing their names or appearances would fool him. What with the wide array of quirks available to him, and 𝐒𝐭 had been shook to her core when he told her exactly who it was they were dealing with, so they wouldn't be doing any of that. Instead, they wanted to offer her an Izuku permanent residence at the only place in Japan, maybe even the world where no villains had ever managed to infiltrate. UA Hero Academy. The idea was simple. Locating them in an area surrounded by top-of-the-line security measures 24/7, where the most intelligent living being in the planet worked and lived, surrounded by the best heroes the nation had to offer and even more that were on the way to being it. 𝐒𝐭𝐚𝐲 had also mentioned having spoken to All Might, and said that since the villain had been discovered in Musutafu, it was highly likely this was his center of operations and everything important regarding him and his crimes would be located here as well, so the number one hero would be remaining here for the nearby future. Living in UA as well. 𝐒𝐭 didn't know what to think. On one hand, she was grateful that they would go so far out of the way just to ensure their safety, but on the other it terrified her to know that despite being part of this program, even when inside the impenetrable walls of the Hero Academy, All for One would still know their names, their faces, their every move and exactly where they would be living, even if there was nothing he could do about it. She wondered what exactly had this man so concerned that he wanted to get to Izuku so much. The child was quirkless, in no way a future threat to anyone, much less a powerful villain as him. As she finally reached 𝐒𝐭𝐚𝐲's office once more, sitting down on the couch with 𝐵𝐶 close behind her, she sighed deeply and nodded her assent. "All right," she muttered. "There's no safer option for us at this point, I guess." 𝐒𝐭𝐚𝐲 nodded at her, jotting something down on his notes and standing up to briefly leave the office, more than likely going to retrieve any paperwork necessary for the procedure that followed their incorporation to UA as permanent residents. 𝐒𝐭 slumped against back, careful to not jostle the now sleeping Izuku in her arms. She looked up, tired eyes focusing on 𝐵𝐶's gentle ones. She smiled slightly, a weak pull on the corner of her lips as she addressed the hero. "Please take care of us, All Might," he huffed a laugh, grinning wide and bright as he nodded at her. "Of course. Leave it all to me." At that same moment, in a dark bedroom on the other side of the city, a young man who should not be awake at these hours of the night felt a shiver run down his spine. "What the hell?" he thought to himself, dropping his phone on the bed as he stood up to turn on the electrical heater in his room. Although he didn't think it would do much good. Whatever that feeling had been, he was sure it had nothing to do with being cold. Because as illogical as it sounded, Aizawa Shouter felt that something was about to come crashing into his life out of absolutely nowhere. As Nezu walked into the police station, he only nodded to the patrolling heroes and working officers, not really looking at any of them. As one of the first animals that developed a quirk, the circumstances of his past had turned him bitter against humanity, and even though he appreciated heroes and the work they did to lead society to a better tomorrow, he couldn't stop seeing the faces of the scientists who held him down and did unspeakable things to him in every single one of them. He would be polite and smile neutrally at everyone, never letting any emotion betray his composure. Never letting them know of his any weakness. When the number one hero and a local detective had contacted him to enlist his help with a case, he accepted as usual. He knew he was far smarter than any person they could come to, and his tactical abilities made him first choice in many plans the police needed help with. He was expecting the typical drug smuggling or illegal underground quirk fighting rings, maybe even a new mafia. When he'd been given the details of the case, he felt curiosity. A kidnapped child. He was not heartless. He would help rescue a child, no doubt. But even knowing this, he didn't feel any different than he did with any other case. He lent his services readily, running mental calculations and planning patrolling routes for the heroes to investigate based on incidents of strange events or sudden rises in crime. When they finally managed to pinpoint the location of the place and performed the rescue without a hitch, Nezu thought his job was done and he could go back to focusing full-time in his school. Until he was given a copy of the report. In the privacy of his office, the talking mammal let his ever-present smile fall. In a move he'd never done before, he picked up his phone and called 𝐒𝐭𝐚𝐲. It was a simple thing of succession of events. All for One had been caught and arrested because, instead of making his escape, he decided to go after the kid he was holding in a cage. He hadn't given a full fight against All Might because he was too preoccupied with reaching the cage. He had wanted to kill the kid so urgently he put his own integrity on the line. That kid was not safe. He'd offered 𝐒𝐭𝐴₃ the possibility to, if ever in need in the near future, house the Midoriyas within the walls of UA. They would enjoy permanent protection and the promise of a relatively normal and peaceful life. He had to admit, as he walked into the detective's office, this had to be the first time in his life he was so angry at being absolutely correct. The young woman on the couch was sound asleep, lying down comfortably on a bunch of pillows and covered in blankets as the rising sun shone through the blinds of the window. Cuddled close to her chest was a tiny lump bundled up tightly, held safely between her arms as the boy inside breathed in and out softly, the blankets rising and falling along. The detective sitting by the desk stood up upon seeing him arrive, looking tired but not caring about having lost his napping spot to the mother-son duo. "Principal 𝐒𝐲, thank you so much for coming in such short notice," 𝐒𝐭𝐴₃ said, bowing in greeting at the newcomer. 𝐒𝐲 liked that about the detective. He treated him with the due respect and not like some sort of weird creature like many others did. "It's no problem at all," Detective 𝐒𝐲 smiled, walking around to jump on the empty chair by the desk, facing the sleeping family on the couch. "I did offer my help, after all, and we're so happy you did. You were right in thinking they would still not be in the clear," 𝐒𝐭𝐴₃ sighed softly, looking at the Midoriyas. 𝐒𝐭 had fallen asleep shortly after accepting the offer, and 𝐒𝐭𝐴₃ had tasked himself with guarding them after All Might had to leave to settle everything down regarding leaving his agency for an indefinite amount of time since he was staying here. As someone who had been in the end of doing 𝐭𝐼𝐴₃'s paperwork many times before, he did not pity Sir Night Eye at all. 𝐒𝐲 nodded, sharp eyes focusing on the little bundle of blankets in the woman's hold. "I'm glad they're all right. It is awfully early though, Detective. Could I bother you with a pot of tea?" 𝐒𝐭𝐴₃ looked surprised for a second but then nodded, remembering how eccentric the hero was. "Of course. I'll be right back." When the man left the room, 𝐒𝐲 stepped down and walked closer to the two people on the couch. He stopped near them and smiled at them, arms resting behind his back. "It's all right, Midoriya-san, I know you're awake." 𝐒𝐿's eyes snapped open, arms tightening around her son as she regarded the hero before her. 𝐒𝐲 knew she'd woken up the moment he stepped into the room, her protective instincts making her react immediately to anything new in her environment. She'd remained with her eyes closed all the time, but 𝐒𝐲 could tell the moment her breathing pattern had turned from being calm and even to forced and synthetic. "You really care about your son, don't you?" 𝐒𝐲 asked, tilting his head at her. She hummed, not moving to sit up lest she woke up her son. "Of course I do. He's my everything," she whispered softly. "You're the one who's taking us to UA, right? Principal 𝐒𝐲." He nodded. "That's right. I've offered you the chance of a safe haven for you and your son to be at peace until we know for sure why All for One is going after him." He turned around and sat back in his chair, paws clasped together on his lap. "I have a very high interest in the safety of your son. May I ask why? You run a school for heroes, and I'm sure you know this already, but Izuku is quirkless," she asked, looking down at the sleeping face of her baby. "What kind of interest could you have in him?" "I relate to him," he said simply, smile still on his face, but 𝐒𝐿 could tell it was a forced one, frozen in place from years of putting up appearances. "What little Izuku here just went through. I can relate." 𝐒𝐿 didn't need to be a super genius like the hero to understand what he meant. It was clear just from seeing him, he wasn't like Officer 𝐒𝐿 or Chief Tsuragami who were humans with animal characteristics. 𝐒𝐿 was an actual animal who had developed a quirk. His story was widely known by everyone in Japan with access to national news. She didn't have to think too hard to imagine what some messed up scientists might have done to him. The scar over his eye pulled at his skin as he smiled wider. 𝐒𝐭𝐴₃ walked back into the office in that moment, carrying a tray and setting it down on his desk. "Ah, Midoriya-san, you're awake," the detective noticed, and he debated on who should he give a cup first. 𝐒𝐿 waved him off. "Midoriya-san looks like she needs something nice right now. Please tend to her first." 𝐒𝐭𝐴₃ nodded, fixing up a cup of tea as 𝐒𝐿 carefully moved to sit up, Izuku shuffling in his sleep but thankfully not waking up. She received the drink with a grateful smile, holding it with her free hand as the other held her son steadily. "Principal 𝐒𝐲 has come to pick you up to personally take you to UA," 𝐒𝐭𝐴₃ said while handing the hero his own cup. "You'll leave as soon as we get green light that everything's ready." The car that'll take you there is a very common one and you won't have any visible security measures to not call any unwanted attention, but rest assured there will be multiple heroes following you there the whole time out of sight. 𝐿𝐭 nodded, understanding a more flashy convoy would no doubt alert any villains to someone of interest being inside whatever vehicle they would be in. Thank you. I normally would feel bad about all the trouble we're causing you, but... Her eyes fell on that sleepy little face once more. I just want him to be all right. 𝐒𝐻𝐈 sipped at his tea, nodding. It's no problem at all. We are all awfully concerned about little Izuku here. The phone on the desk started ringing, and 𝐒𝐻𝐈 hurried to pick it up. As he spoke with whoever it was on the other side, 𝐒𝐻𝐈 set down his cup and approached the woman again. Needless to say, I intend on making sure Izuku's educational needs are met, personally, he said. I can set up a curriculum for every year of school he will need starting when his age appropriate, and he'd be given a spot at UA once he needs to start high school proper. Are you serious? 𝐿𝐭 whispered. You'd do that for him? 𝐒𝐻𝐈 nodded once more, and 𝐿𝐭 could somehow feel his smile, though remaining exactly the same, was now warmer and honest. Not to toot my own horn, but I'm an excellent teacher, Midoriya-san, he gestured at the sleeping boy. And also I've been told your son is far more mentally developed than other children his age. It should be no problem for him to keep up with my lessons. 𝐿𝐭 was at a loss for words. She hadn't really considered through all of this how being basically secluded from everything would impact Izuku's life outside of keeping him, well, alive. The idea of his formal education had completely slipped her mind when she'd agreed to the protection program, but it lifted a huge weight from her shoulders to know someone had already planned for that. 𝐒𝐻𝐈 came back a second later, throwing on his coat and reaching for his hat. Everything's ready to go, Midoriya-san. They're waiting for you outside. 𝐿𝐭 steeled herself, taking a moment to breathe deeply before standing up, jolting Izuku out of his sleep at the sudden move. 𝐿𝐵, he said, hand rubbing his eye as he clung to her. The blanket fell and pulled around his shoulders. It's all right, Izuku. We're just gonna go for a drive for a while, she reassured him. Go back to sleep. Izuku shook his head, looking around as he slowly woke up. His eyes fell on 𝐒𝐻𝐈 and froze there. He leaned forward, hand twitching as if wanting to reach forward the same way he did with Chief Tsuragami, but something was stopping him. Good morning, Izuku. 𝐒𝐻𝐈 greeted him, waving a paw up at the boy. My name's 𝐒𝐻𝐈, I'm the principal at UA Hero School. Izuku asked, reverence slipping into his voice as his eyes shone. Tsukochi chuckled, leading them forward out of the office. 𝐒𝐻𝐈 kept step with 𝐿𝐭 as he continued his conversation with Izuku. That's right. And that's where we're going right now. Are you excited? Izuku gasped, nodding fervently. 𝐿𝐭 could hope he would react just as well when he was told once they made it inside campus, they would never be leaving again. The sun shone brightly down on them as they reached the doors, Izuku blinking at the sudden light surrounding him. It was warmer than he liked it and he shook the blanket off of him, letting it dangle from 𝐿𝐭's arm. 𝐒𝐻𝐈 eyed the clothes the kid was wearing. Do you like All Might, Izuku? Izuku, clad in his favorite All Might hoodie, smiled widely. Yes. We played. Ah yes, I heard about that. You had some fun last night with the other heroes too, right? Midnight was here looking over you as well. Izuku nodded. She's nice. The car that waited for them was a simple old model, paint chipping off the doors and dirty windows half rolled down. Officer 𝐒𝐽 awaited by the driver's door, quickly saluting them as they approached. When Tsukochi opened the door, however, 𝐿𝐭 could see the interior was as pristine as it could possibly be. She climbed in carefully, making sure Izuku wouldn't hit his head as she sat down and scooted to the middle seat as the detective instructed her. 𝐒𝐻𝐈 got on next, sitting down next to her by the window as Tsukochi walked around to climb on her other side. 𝐒𝐽 sat behind the wheel and started the car, taking off at a leisurely pace. 𝐿𝐭 thought she could see figures moving by the buildings, blurry shapes jumping by the rooftops alongside the car. Tsukochi noticed the concern furrowing her brow. That's the hero I told you about, he explained. They're staying out of sight to not attract attention, but they'll be following us the whole way there, making sure nothing goes wrong, I see. Izuku was wriggling in place, trying to catch sight of the heroes the detective was talking about, but they were too fast for his eyes. Midnight. he asked, looking at his mother, eyes brimming with curiosity. 𝐒𝐲 chuckled next to him. "Midnight is at home right now, getting ready for school I reckon," he said to the boy. "You might be able to meet her again once we arrive at you." Izuku smiled wide, jumping in place on his mother's lap in excitement at seeing the nice girl again. UA was some ways away from the precinct, certainly a longer trip than between it and the Midoriya household, so the three occupants in the back seat spent a lot of time entertaining and energy-bursting Izuku, telling him tales about various heroes or making him guess some by giving him clues about their quirks. All in all, Izuku spent a good time, forgetting all about the stress of the night before. His eyes drifted outside the window, however, when the looming infrastructure of the Hero Academy made its appearance around the corner. He crawled his way out of Inko's lap and onto Tsukochi's, startling the detective who could only do his best to stay stock-still to not jostle the child as Izuku looked out at the building. Inko laughed at the detective's face. Naomasa might have been good with children, but that didn't mean he had any experience handling them. "Mema!" Izuku shouted, pointing outside. "We go here." Inko nodded, smiling at him while trying to keep her worry and sadness out of her eyes. Once the car crossed the gates, there'd be no turning back for them. The car drove around the building, tall concrete walls separating it from the outside world with what Inko could assume were hundreds of other hidden security measures. They stopped in front of an iron gate, the car stopping to let 𝐒𝐲 out to talk to the person guarding the entrance. After a moment he was back, a few of what looked like entry passes in his paws. "These are the same passes students and staff must wear to not trigger UA security system," he explained, handing one over to everyone in the car. "You must place some of your DNA in the little slot on top to have yourselves registered before you can cross the gates. A single hair or a bit of saliva will do," the officers nodded, hurrying to pull out one of their hairs to activate the device. Inko on the other hand decided to like the tip of her finger so Izuku could do the same, showing him how to do it himself on his own pass. As soon as it was done, their pictures and information appeared on them, surprising them. "We are linked to the government in a way, we have access to a lot of official information so we could get your passes done at the last minute without bothering you too much," 𝐒𝐲 answered the unspoken question. "We should be all ready to go, then." The hero nodded at the guard, letting them know it was all set so they could open the gate. When the car drove through, their passes lit up with a little green light, letting them know they were accepted into the campus. As Inko saw the gate closing behind them through the rearview mirror, she silently bid goodbye to her old life, and tried to embrace the beginning of this new one. "I'm telling you, it was the weirdest thing," 𝐒𝐿 grumbled as he walked to class, Hisashi humming along as he walked next to him. "It was just this random chill at 4:00 in the morning, why were you even up so late?" "It's the middle of the week," Hisashi asked him, stepping ahead to open the door for his grumpy boyfriend to walk through. 𝐒𝐿 mumbled a thank you before making his way to his desk. "I drank my mom's coffee by mistake instead of mine. I fell asleep like 3 hours ago, babe, I don't want to hear it." 𝐒𝐿's mom had the weirdest quirk, one that allowed her to sleep better the strongest the coffee she drank. It was clearly labeled, and yet 𝐒𝐿 had a bad habit of not being conscious enough when he fixed his usual cups, so this wasn't a rare occurrence. 𝐒𝐿 sat down on his desk and immediately face-planted on the surface, eager to let his eyes remain closed a few more minutes. Hisashi sat down in the place next to him, playing an imaginary drum with his fingers as he hummed along to some song permanently stuck to his head. "Hey, so what was it about that weird feeling you were telling me about?" 𝐒𝐿 groaned, accepting his early death and kissing his last-minute nap goodbye as he sat up straight. "I don't know, just this strange foreboding feeling running up and down my spine. Like a warning or something, maybe it was the coffee." Maybe. The door slid open with a slam, a smiling Nemuri skipping her way inside, followed closely by Tensai as he made sure her move hadn't dented the door again. She slid gracefully into her seat, swiveling around to face the zombie sitting behind her. "Morning," she greeted, way too cheerful for someone who had a night shift just a few hours ago. "Isn't it a lovely day?" "Whatever you're sniffing, I want it," 𝐒𝐿 said, resting his head in his hand. With Nemuri here, there was now absolutely no way he'd be at peace until the teacher arrived. "I'm not high," she huffed, then smiled brightly again. "Well, I am high on something, the cutest guy I've ever met." Hisashi leaned her way, wanting to hear more of that. "What, you met someone during patrol?" She nodded, bringing a finger to her lips. It's a secret though, but you'll meet him later on, I'm sure. Tensai finally joined them after making sure the room was structurally intact, taking the last place available around 𝐿𝐴. Is that why you're so happy? Must be a really special guy then. He's the most adorable, cutest, sweetest little honeybun I've ever. The teacher, making her way into the room, cut her short in her sugary description, slamming her metal gauntlet on the desk to gather everyone's attention. All right kiddos, there's been a rescheduling for today, she announced, a slip of paper held in her other hand. Principal 𝐒𝐻𝐿 has called for a last-minute meeting for all the school, right now. Apparently there's some information concerning everyone that shall be addressed there, and then we can go back to normal class. She looked at them, her students blinking in stupefaction. Well, am I speaking Greek here? Move. Everyone scrambled to their feet, forming a line and leaving the room in as much order as you could ask of a bunch of 17-year-olds. Midnight resumed her skipping from before, jumping down the hall like a little girl going for ice cream instead of the oldest student in class that she was. Not that anyone would dare mention that out loud, of course. Soon enough the entire school was gathered in the courtyard, every class standing up in line, 𝐻𝐿𝐴 subtly trying to stand on his tiptoes to make up for the 2 centimeters difference that had him standing in front of his 𝐼𝐴 and failing miserably, and waiting for the principal to make his appearance. The teachers without a homeroom class were standing on the stage, chatting hurriedly among themselves. There were 3 empty chairs right behind the podium. What do you think this is about? Tensai whispered, leaning forward to reach both his 𝐼𝐴 and 𝐻𝐿𝐴. He looked worried, but not for the reason one might think. You don't think it's about last week's food fight, right? I swear I didn't mean to start it. I just got a piece of chicken stuck in one of my pipes and when I blew it out it hit Kinomoto in the face. I swear I helped lunch rush clean afterwards. Calm down, 𝐻𝐿𝐴 said, sighing as he rubbed the bridge of his nose. God, he was too tired for this. No one in this school would believe you started a food fight on purpose even if you did. Must be something else. His 𝐼𝐴 nodded, resting his head on 𝐻𝐿𝐴's shoulder. And what's with those extra seats? All the teachers are where they should be already. The general noise of the students talking simmered to silence as the principal hopped his way up the stage, a group of people no one had seen before following behind him. 𝐻𝐿𝐴 could hear Nemirise squealing all the way from her place on the other line where the girls stood. 2 of the people who took the empty chairs looked official, wearing professional clothes and keeping a rigid posture all the while. The other person was a young woman who looked like she could use a nap, her clothes a bit rumpled but overall looking pretty average. In her arms was the most surprising thing though, a little kid who was her spitting image but with a puff of hair turning his head this way and that with shiny eyes, wriggling in place on her lap. 𝐒𝐻𝐿𝐴 hopped on the podium, fixing the microphone to fit his height and clearing his throat. Good morning, my dear students, he greeted them. I apologize for taking you from your usual schedules with this sudden meeting, but there has been a new development everyone on campus should be made aware of. The students started chattering among themselves, whispering concerns and possible reasons for the announcement. Some were just commenting on the cute kid and waving at him as he looked their direction and waved back. Now, I'm sure as future heroes you have been keeping up with the news, right? 𝐒𝐻𝐿𝐴 let his silence go long enough for the students to nod their agreement. So most of you already know of All Might's presence in Out Little City, and the reason he is here at all, the kidnapped kid. His 𝐼𝐴 said, louder than he intended. He blushed when he realized he didn't moderate his volume, and grinned sheepishly at the giggles it got him from everyone around him. 𝐒𝐻𝐿𝐴 nodded, unbothered by the interruption. Indeed. All Might helped rescue a missing child and, in the same vein, managed to bring down an exceedingly powerful villain. That child, he turned around halfway, extending a paw towards the woman and the child sitting behind him. Is right here. Voices erupted from the crowd, surprise and disbelief as shouts crossed the courtyard. The same students who had been waving at the kid were now gaping at him. The younger first years were talking their heads off to each other while the older ones were mostly quiet, some of them having gotten first-hand information from their tutoring heroes the past week. The sudden rush of voices all over the place had the kid cowering against his mother's figure. Hey! Nemirai yelled over the crowd. You're scaring him, 𝐿𝐴. Immediately everyone fell silent. The boy peeked back around now that the noise was gone, and his eyes met Nemirai's. Midnight, he called, waving at her with both hands and smiling. 𝐒𝐬𝐴. She greeted back, jumping in place to make it easier for him to see her. Nezu cleared his throat. Yes, thank you Kiyama-san. Now he continued. The purpose of this meeting. This child, Midoriya Izuku, and his mother Midoriya Inko, will be joining us here at UA permanently as the first additions to a new witness protection program I have offered to initiate. Talk started anew, more subdued this time. A hand shot up through the crowd. Yes, Ida-san. Nezu gave him the go-ahead. Tensai lowered his hand. Sir. What's the purpose of implanting a witness protection program if you're announcing it to us so freely? Are we to assume those are their real names as well? Surely there must be some danger to this. People around him nodded, agreeing with his concerns. But you see, Nezu started again, smile firmly in place. The villain responsible for this is incredibly powerful and resourceful. We are absolutely sure he already knows where the Midoriyas are, even jailed as he is, he said. It's unnecessary to change names or keep information from you since, realistically speaking, it's nothing we can keep hidden from him. Or do you think All Might's involvement was because he just so happened to be strolling by? This time, everyone remained silent. Someone bad enough that All Might had to be brought in had taken this kid. And he'd survived. The reason we want all this to be known to you is because Midoriya-san and her son will be living here permanently, and as such you will be seeing them around campus. The villain in question undoubtedly has lackeys all over the city, all over the country. They are not safe, Nezu emphasized, leaning forward in the podium to put weight behind his words. There is no place in this world better for them than here, at UA, and as pro-heroes and future heroes, we are sworn to protect those in need. I am confident that all of you will do everything in your power to make their stay a comfortable and uneventful one, considering everything they've already been through. The surprised and concerned faces of the students had slowly morphed through his speech, turning determined and serious. Some were nodding along to his words, remembering all the information they'd heard about the case, about how long the kid had been lost and how ridiculously hidden the place they kept him in was. This was no laughing matter. The man sitting next to Inko stood up, walking to the principal and tapping his shoulder to get his attention before whispering something in his ear. Nezu nodded at whatever he'd been told, and turned back to the students. Midoriya-san would like to address some words to you all, so I'll be giving her the podium, and I expect all of you to be quiet and respectful, he said, waiting for the woman to stand up and walk towards him. She kept her son in her arms, and Nezu adjusted the microphone for her before jumping off the podium. The first thing everyone noticed was how the young woman was so short she could barely reach the mic, having to stand up in one of the steps the principal used to be seen properly. The second were the bags under her eyes and the way she clung to her son. She cleared her throat, looking nervous at being the center of attention of so many people, never mind most of them were just children. "Hello," she started, voice soft and careful. "I'm Midoriya Inko. This is my son, Izuku." She hoisted the boy higher on her hip, his thumb stuck in his mouth as he looked around at them. "We'll be in your care from now on." She stopped for a moment to clear her throat once more, her obvious unease breaking some hearts in the crowd. Hisashi brought a hand to his chest. "What we've been through. It's indescribable." "Izuku is only 2 years old," the younger students gasped, not having known that tidbit from the news. "He only knew about the protection program this morning, after we'd already made it here. He took it surprisingly well." She huffed a laugh, the sound making Izuku turn towards her with a smile around his thumb, his other hand coming to touch her cheek. The girls in the crowd sighed at the sweet gesture. "I know all this is worrying, and maybe even scary for some of you, having someone like us among you who is likely to attract trouble in the future. That's not true. Don't worry about us. Please let us know if you need anything." The onslaught of encouraging words from the students almost made her take a step back in surprise, the risk of falling off the podium the main thing keeping her still. A wobbly smile split her face, tears gathering at the corner of her eyes. "Thank you," she sniffled, wiping at her eyes with the sleeve of her sweater. I only want to give my son the best life he can get. So thank you for being so understanding. I'll make sure to not be a bother to you." Izuku stared at his mother, the hand still on her cheek brushing tears away. His thumb left his mouth and he wrapped his arms around her neck, hugging her and smooshing their cheeks together as consolation, the same way she would do for him when he was sad. 𝐒𝐭 laughed and pet her son's hair, bowing quickly at the students before turning around to step down and go back to her seat. Before she could do so, however, 𝐒𝐿 leaned towards the 𝐵𝐴. "Thank you," he said, his sweet little voice reverberating through the courtyard. And just like that, as the woman and her son went back to her seat, an entire campus worth of people fell in love. "That was who you were talking about." Hisashi pulled on Nemurai's jacket insistently as they made their way back to the classroom. 𝐲𝐸 was tucked under his other arm, glaring thoughtfully at the floor. "Yup. Isn't he just the cutest little marshmallow? I was on duty guarding their apartment last night," she grinned. "I had all the information from Detective Tsukochi since I got involved in the case, so I knew they would be arriving today." "Sure looked pretty happy for a kid held in a lab for 4 months," Hisashi wondered, letting go of her jacket to bring his hand up to his chin in thought. "Kids deal with trauma differently," 𝐲𝐸 said, wrapping his arm around Hisashi's waist. "He might look normal to us because we don't know him, but to his mother he might have been completely different after the rescue. Maybe he's just dealing with it in a way he's not broadcasting." "Oh, absolutely," Nemurai agreed, smile dimming on her face. "Last night when I met him, he looked so excited to meet me when he realized I was a hero," she sighed. "Then we had to distract him so the detective could ask Midoriya-san some delicate questions, and his whole face fell so fast. He was terrified to be apart from her. I'm still worried, though. I trust UA's defenses to hold up against mostly anything, but if the villains already know about them there's not much that can be done." Tensai sighed, running a hand through his hair. His concerns regarding the safety of the little family remained even through Nezu's reassurances they'd taken all the security measures possible. Hisashi hummed. "Izuku is the same age as Tenya, isn't he?" Tensai sighed, nodding. "I guess that's what got me so jumpy about this. I guess I can somehow put myself in Midoriya-san's shoes. That'd be a tight fit," 𝐲𝐸 said. "She's tiny." That managed to get a surprised snort out of Tensai, and Hisashi kissed 𝐲𝐸's cheek noisily as reward for taking his mind out of it. "Izuku will be attending UA once he's of age," Nemurai added as they entered the classroom. "Who knows? Maybe they'll meet and be besties." Tensai smiled, sitting down as the teacher started writing on the board. "That'd be nice. This is where you'll be staying." Nezu gestured widely at a nice little home unit off to the side in an area of campus near the teacher's building. It looked new, 1 floor and simple but big enough for the two of them, with a little garden surrounding it and a cute white picket fence around to give it that cozy feeling. "We asked one of our teachers to build it for you. Cementos almost insisted on taking care of it once he got the news," Nezu explained. "Once we have it confirmed that All Might will indeed be staying here, his own apartment will be built right next to yours." 𝐭 stared at the house in wonder. I don't know what to say." She slowly walked towards the fence, her hand brushing against the top carefully, as if afraid it would crumble to dust at her touch. She pushed the door open, walking through the garden towards the door. "This is so thoughtful of you," Nezu waved her off. "It's the minimum we can offer. But please, make your way inside." The door's open, indeed it was, as she made her way in. She absently took her and Izuku's shoes off at the Genkan, fitting the little soft slippers on her son's feet even if he still couldn't walk, and some of her own. The entry hallway was short, leading almost immediately into a normal living room leading into the kitchen to the side, similar to her own apartment. There was a fireplace against the far wall, new furniture surrounding it in a comfortable semicircle of couches and side tables. On the other side of the room opened another hallway leading to 5 doors, which upon closer inspection led to 2 fully furnished bedrooms and 2 empty ones, most likely for her to decide what to turn into. Izuku's room, she noticed, was exactly like his old one. Even his furniture, toys, and decorations were all placed exactly in the same place. "We thought it would be better for Izuku to retain his old space exactly as it was, to not make him add adapting to a new environment to his worries. We brought all his stuff from your apartment. Your room as well. We replaced everything from the living room and kitchen, seeing how most of it got destroyed during the break-in." 𝐭 kept looking around in awe, slowly moving to sit down in one of the couches. Izuku leaned against her stomach, staring at the slippers in his feet as he kicked his legs up and down. "Baby, do you like it here?" she asked him softly, running her hand through his hair. Izuku hummed. Is nice, 𝐂𝐻𝐻 smiled at the boy, walking around to stand in front of him. I'm glad you like it, Izuku. He offered his hand for the boy to hold, letting him entertain himself with the soft fur and squishy beans of his paw. There's someone else I'd like you to meet, if that's alright. 𝐭 tilted her head. Someone else? Wasn't everyone at the meeting just now? He shook his head. Someone was missing. She just arrived a few minutes ago and went straight to her office. She'd be vital for Izuku's physical therapy while he's living here, so I thought it'd be best for you to go see her as soon as possible. He tightened his fingers around Izuku's, holding his hand in his. You've actually already met, as I was told. You remember Recovery Girl, don't you, Izuku? He startled up to attention at the name, smiling. Yes. The hospital, would you like to see her again? Izuku nodded enthusiastically, and it was enough for them to take off. As the principal guided them through the halls of UA, some teachers walking by stopped to greet them and introduce themselves properly. Students were already in class, so it was empty aside from them, and 𝐭 thought it would be beneficial for Izuku to meet as many heroes as his little heart desired. These halls seem endless, 𝐭 wondered as they kept walking. It caught her attention how they seemed to be painted as a highway, with a segmented line in the middle, most likely to keep order as the students walked. I hope we don't get lost when going around here on our own. There's nothing to worry about, everything is properly signalized. Also, you'll be given a new phone, courtesy of our support department, with a map to show you where you need to go, 𝐂𝐻𝐻 explained. Besides, the students are more than willing to lend you a hand. Would you ever get lost? She nodded, still looking around the halls and out the windows in search for any landmark she could use to locate herself in the future. When they reached the end of a hallway on the 3rd floor, they encountered the familiar figure of Recovery Girl waiting for them outside her office. Just like last time, her white doctor's coat was off and tied around her cane. Izuku perked up immediately at seeing her. 𝐿𝐻𝐵. He managed to get out, her hero name too long even for him to pronounce fully. The heroine chuckled, cane tapping against the floor as she closed the distance between them. You can call me Chiyo, Izuku Chuichin. Izuku sounded out, content with the new name he could call her by now. That's right, she approved. She then looked up at 𝐭. I'm sorry I couldn't be there when you were introduced to the school. I had some last-minute business to take care of. 𝐭 shook her head. Oh please, don't apologize. It's not my intention to keep you from your work. She smiled at the woman, crouching down slowly so she and Izuku could be at the same height. Besides, Izuku wanted to see you again. It's better here where it's not so full of people. Izuku smiled at the older woman, offering her a hand. She took it and held it carefully, smiling at the boy. 𝐭 couldn't help but notice how Izuku seemed really eager to hold people's hands. Maybe part of his need for affection now that he had it readily available once more. She'd have to ask his therapist about it later. I would invite you into my office for some tea, but I'm afraid the infirmary is undergoing some last-minute renovations. Recovery Girl apologized. 𝐭 waved her hand. Don't worry about it, we understand. Oh. But please feel free to come visit us anytime. I'd love to try out our new living room to host some guests. Izuku loves tea parties, don't you, baby? Lots of sugar. Izuku laughed, even more when his mother showered his face with kisses. She seemed to be doing that more and more every time he laughed. 𝐂𝐻𝐻 nodded approvingly. A soul after my own. The sudden chiming of the bell alerted them of lunchtime having started, and soon enough the sound of hundreds of feet making their way to the cafeteria echoed through the halls. I didn't realize we'd spent so long in the house and then coming here, 𝐭 muttered. Izuku has to eat about now, then allow me to show you to the cafeteria. Lunch rush has already been informed of Izuku's special diet, 𝐂𝐻𝐻 offered, leading the way away from the nurse's office. I'm sure the students will be glad to see you as well. 𝐭 and Izuku bid their farewells to Recovery Girl before following the hero down the hall and into the main building. The multiple greeting of the kids for the Midoriyas once they were on site made Chiyo chuckle. They would be just fine living here. As she unwrapped her white coat from around her syringe-shaped cane and put it back on, she slipped into the infirmary and looked at the almost finished job of replacing the white tiles of the floor for dark blue ones, and the halfway done nature paintings on the walls. Soon enough the infirmary would be colorful and warm, no sight of the old white room that could make Izuku uncomfortable should he ever need to use it. And she would also be looking into replacing her cane for a more common-looking one. She reached her desk and sat down, sighing as she closed the report on Izuku's physical and mental health status post-rescue. They would be just fine. I still don't understand how 𝐒 let me go so easily, Toshinori told Naomasa as they drove through the city. Usually he's so stiff about my schedule, but now he practically threw me out the door when I told him. Maybe he realized you need a vacation. Naomasa wondered, eyes ahead as he drove. I mean, not that this is a vacation, you still have to work. Maybe he wanted you to change sceneries for a while, Toshinori hummed, looking out the window at the passing buildings. Musutafu is a nice little city, I must say. Much quieter than Tokyo. Despite having lived in Musutafu himself as a teenager when attending UA, Toshinori had spent most of his life in big cities where crime skyrocketed due to the denser population attracting the worst villains. He'd been stationed in Tokyo for years, and had almost forgotten the quaint little place that saw his beginnings in the world of heroics. The trees lining the streets and well-loved little houses gave the place almost a fairy tale look compared to the biggest cities with their lights and noise. The couple of days he'd spent putting his business in order back at his agency had him a bit jittery. He'd received constant updates from Naomasa, and knew that the Midoriyas had made it safely to UA and had been extremely well accepted by both staff and students alike. He had no worries regarding their stay, but he was here to investigate the ties all for one had in the city. And Midoriya Izuku seemed to be in the eye of that particular storm. Has Nezu commented where I'll be staying? He asked, suddenly remembering the offer the principal had made him. Naomasa nodded. He wants you to stay next to the Midoriyas, he said. The H-shaped building of UA became visible once they turned the corner. Cementos should have built the place already, all you have to do is move in. I see. Once they were properly identified and made their way through the gates, Naomasa parked and they left the car. It was apparently the middle of lunchtime and a lot of students were milling around campus, sitting on the grass and just enjoying being outside the stuffy classrooms. Most of them immediately noticed All Might's imposing figure and exclaimed in surprise and excitement, scrambling to stand up and crowd around him. Toshinori, used to this kind of reaction from people, laughed and turned this way and that, trying to greet everyone talking to him. But he realized the students were accumulating in excess, and soon enough any escape route he might have had was vanishing before his very eyes. He turned around to ask Naomasa for help only to see the detective walking away and into the building, abandoning him to the mercy of his fans. Toshinori tried calling out to him, but the detective feigned not hearing him. In the last second before the door closed behind the detective, he turned around enough to flash a smug smile at the hero. That's what he got for stealing his chocolate, Toshinori thought as he surrendered to his fate. Naomasa meanwhile was swiftly making his way through the students rushing down the halls as they heard the news of All Might's presence in the school gardens. Some teachers were around making sure nothing happened with so many kids running up and down the halls, and they nodded at Naomasa as he made his way to Nezu's office. With the amazing memory the principal had, there was no need for a secretary to remind him of his appointment, so Naomasa knew the hero was at the ready and waiting for him once he reached his door. He knocked on it as a courtesy, waiting for the go-ahead from the hero to let himself in. Detective. Good morning, Nezu greeted him, cup of tea ever present in his hand and a full thermos of it in front of him on the coffee table, waiting to pass its judgment on Naomasa's bladder. Please take a seat. I see All Might couldn't make it past the garden. You could say that, Naomasa laughed, taking off his hat and coat and letting himself fall on the couch opposite the principal. If I didn't know any better I'd think you called us here at this hour just to trap him like that. Nezu laughed himself, smile hidden behind his cup. I thought it would be a good idea to let the students get used to him being here, since from now on he will be a semi-permanent presence. He sipped at his drink, letting the silence hang for a moment. I just wish it was under better circumstances. Naomasa understood what he meant. They were both fully aware of the secret behind Toshinori's quirk, and knew the man was on the constant look for a possible successor. He was still in peak condition, but he wouldn't be young forever, and he needed to find the perfect candidate for the responsibility, one for all required in a wielder. Had this chain of events been any different, or just plainly never happened, Toshinori might have eventually ended up at UA anyway to scout for possible candidates. Right now, however, he was here to completely dismantle everything regarding the bane of his existence, and to protect the ones responsible of him finally apprehending him. There was a small tremor suddenly, and a loud choir of exclamations followed it. 𝐒𝐻𝐽 calmly accepted the cup of tea Nezu was handing him, both ignoring the hero now landing to stand on the windowsill outside the office. 𝐶𝐿 softly knocked on the window, trying to get their attention so they could let him in after he could only think of literally leaping up and away to escape the students clamoring around him. He could have just as easily broken the window or ripped the frame of its hinges, but he was kind of scared of what Nezu would do to him as payback, especially now that they'd be on constant contact from now on. He kept tapping the glass insistently until 𝐒𝐻𝐽 got fed up and stood up, sighing in annoyance at the drama his best friend would retort to for such mundane tasks. Couldn't you just have jumped to the other side of the building and got in through the door like any normal person? He berated him, slapping his arm as 𝐶𝐿 walked in. But I was already there. 𝐶𝐿 pouted, and 𝐒𝐽 could not believe this oversized child was the strongest man in the world. Sit down already, we have to go over your living arrangements so I can go back to work, 𝐒𝐽 said, pushing the hero towards the couch. Once 𝐶𝐿 had sat down, Nezu slid a cup for him across the table. His hands were too large for the tiny porcelain and he had trouble picking it up. 𝐒𝐽 felt Nezu was making fun of him on purpose. So, as I'm sure you already were informed, you will be staying in your own place next to Midoriya-san and Izuku, Nezu started saying. The building is ready, but we left it empty in case you wanted to choose your own furnishing. You got money, Nezu was truly trying to say. Don't make me waste my school's budget on yours. I've also talked this in depth with Midoriya-san and we both agreed it would be best if you had a copy of the key to her house, he continued. What? A copy? Why? 𝐶𝐿 asked, looking around at 𝐒𝐽 and Nezu. Nezu took a little keychain with UA's logo and threw it at 𝐶𝐿, who had to scramble to both catch it and not drop the cup in his hand. God knew if a single drop of tea fell, the next spill in the room would be his blood by Nezu's squishy little paws. He managed to not drop any. Seeing how part of your stay is about making sure they are safe, it's only logical you could have access to them 24/7, Nezu answered. You know, just in case, also if you just want to stop by and play with Zuko, 𝐒𝐽 added. 𝐶𝐿 snapped his head to look at him, ears reddening. What's that supposed to mean? Oh please, like you didn't take a shining to him back at the station, he said, pulling out his phone and thumbing through the apps to look for something. I know you can't see your own face, but Midnight and her camera sure can. He turned the screen towards 𝐶𝐿, letting him see whatever he'd been looking for. The picture, taken exactly from the angle Midnight had been standing next to them that night they took Izuku out to the garden, showed 𝐶𝐿 sitting on the ground, holding Izuku so he could lean forward and play with the grass. His grip on the child was delicate but firm, sure to not let him fall but also avoiding any spot that might make the boy uncomfortable. His face, as 𝐒𝐽 had said, was absolutely smitten with the wonder on the little kid's face. He was smiling, brows relaxed from their usual firm and proud position. Blue eyes alert to their surrounding but softening at the corners as he saw Izuku leave his own fear behind. 𝐒𝐽 swiped to the next pic, this one of Izuku sitting on the wall and surrounded by other heroes talking to him. This time 𝐶𝐿 was standing behind him, his broad figure managing to surround the kid by all sides except the front while at the same time giving him enough space to not feel overwhelmed. This picture was extremely funny for 𝐒𝐽 and extremely embarrassing for 𝐶𝐿 because, in contrast to the soft expression he had in the previous one, here he was pursing his lips and narrowing his eyes at the heroes, taking Izuku's attention from him. 𝐶𝐿 turned around, crossing his arms and pouting as he refused to look at either of them. He didn't need to know both the detective and the principal were just as taken with the boy as he was. They liked having their fun at his expense anyway. 𝐒𝐽 chuckled as he stood up, sliding his phone back into his pocket and picking up his hat and coat. I'll send you the photos, you big baby. 𝐶𝐿 kept pouting, but the corners of his mouth raised a bit. Principal Nezu, 𝐒𝐽 tipped his hat at the hero. A pleasure to see you again. Feel free to call me if you need help wrangling this guy. I'll have it in mind. The principal smiled at him, standing up to accompany to the door. And you as well, feel free to come visit anytime, 𝐒𝐽 smiled. With this guy here now. You might as well build me my own house. Izuku looked around in wonder, his feet taking careful steps forward while his mother held his hands. She was walking behind him, his arms up in the air so she could reach them while helping him take his first slow, wobbly steps in months. They stepped through the walkway across the campus gardens, the firm concrete helping Izuku keep his balance as he decided how and where to take the next step. It was calm around them, most students busy in class in the surrounding buildings, but 𝐭 could see and hear some of them plus their teachers watching them through the windows, some recording or taking pictures of Izuku's progress. "That's great, baby, you're doing so well," 𝐭 cooed down at him, keeping track of how many steps he took before he got tired. She couldn't help think how sad it was he had to learn to walk again, when he had just learned to do so for the first time a little over a year ago. Izuku, at least, didn't seem to think this was weird. He was fascinated by the trees and birds surrounding him, looking up to see the clouds float by. He was walking mostly by instinct, trusting his mother to make sure he didn't fall. They'd been living as permanent resident at the academy for a couple of days, and most of the time they spent going around the fields, learning the way around to not get lost in the future. The students and teachers would always stop by to chat with them, ask how their day was going and if they could do something for them, maybe bother lunch rush with a snack for Izuku. 𝐭 couldn't express in words how grateful she was they treated her and her son how they would treat any other person, and not the targets of an evil maniac. The time they spend indoors they would work on Izuku's physical therapy, training moving his arms and legs. He was mostly in good condition now, only having to make sure Izuku didn't fall asleep while sitting so he wouldn't get a crick in the neck. One of his favorite exercises was to lie down on his back on the couch and raise both legs in the air, kicking them back and forth as if swimming while he watched the hero news on TV. "Mama, look!" he suddenly exclaimed, snapping 𝐭 back to the present. His hand was trying to break free from her grasp to point at a nearby butterfly fluttering over a flowery bush. "Careful, love, don't let go of me," 𝐭 warned him, smiling once he stopped. "Do you know what that is?" "Butterfly," he said, tilting his head back to grin at her. "Eats flowers." "They eat nectar," she corrected him. "It's inside the flowers," Izuku nodded, looking very serious at the new information. "And he sounded out. "Not flowers." "Got it," he nodded at the butterfly as well, as if saluting it before looking forward and starting to walk again. 𝐭 gradually lightened her hold on his hands, never letting go but letting Izuku carry most of his weight on his own. He stumbled a bit, stopping to ground himself and remember how to properly lift his legs without his mother holding him up completely. Then he kept going. It seemed he'd gotten into a good rhythm after a while, almost not needing to stop at all unless he needed to catch his breath. He understood that these walks would be necessary to help him get by on his own again, the same way he understood he should stop eating when he felt full even if he still wanted more so he wouldn't upset his tummy. The next time he stopped, looking curiously at a snail dragging itself in front of him, 𝐭 leaned down lower to be in his field of vision. "Izuku," she said. "Would you like to try it on your own?" The reaction was instantaneous. Izuku's head snapped back, looking up at her with such a scared expression 𝐭 almost fell to her knees to hug him, but doing so would cause Izuku to fall. His knees buckled anyway, and 𝐭 used her quirk to pull him up into her arms. He buried his face into her neck, arms locking tightly around her as he shivered. As she had realized was now his custom, he did not cry. "I did bad," Izuku whispered, voice wavy with fear and laced with the tears he apparently could no longer shed. "No, no, no, baby," 𝐭 shushed him, running her hand down his back comfortingly. "You did great, I'm not leaving you alone, won't leave?" he asked her, leaning back a bit to lock eyes with her. "I will never leave," she reassured him, kissing his forehead and cheeks in turn. "Mama will never leave." 𝐭 was scared. It wasn't just that Izuku seemed unable to have her out of his sight, it was her as well who couldn't stand the idea of leaving him alone. Even if she was the one who suggested him to try walking on his own, she didn't even hesitate to hold him when he showed the minimal sign of distress. She knew Izuku was just a baby and needed to be around her all the time anyway, but before the kidnapping he would run around the house and stay in his room or the living room on his own while she was busy with work or house chores. He had been as independent as a 2-year-old could be. Had Izuku not been taken, he would have been allowed to hang around the local park on his own with other children his age in merely a year more. At this rate, though, it would be years before he would be able to willingly let go of 𝐭's hand. She needed help. Shouter choked when the collar of his shirt dug into his windpipe. He whirled around, coughing as he rubbed his sore throat and glared at Hisashi as his boyfriend let go of his jacket from where he'd pulled him back. Hisashi had stopped walking in front of the announcements board, eyes skimming over the flyers tacked to it. "What the hell, Zashi?" 𝐂𝐿 said, punching his arm. "I almost died." "Babe, shut up a second please," Hisashi said back, holding up a finger right in 𝐂𝐿's face, making him go cross-eyed from how close it was. "I'm reading," 𝐂𝐿 huffed, walking behind him and standing on his toes to see over his shoulder at whatever had caught his attention. "Tap dance lessons." "No," Hisashi shouted. Then he considered and ripped the flyer out. "Well, maybe. But no, this one." He pointed at one lower down, and 𝐂𝐿 had to actually push Hisashi out of the way to be able to read it. "Babysitting. Are you for real?" 𝐂𝐿 grinned, half expecting Hisashi to tell him he was joking and he was actually looking at the one next to it about braiding for dogs. Hisashi didn't look like was joking. 𝐂𝐿's face fell. Before he even realized it, his hand had been grabbed and he had been dragged to the principal's office as fast as if Tensai himself had given him a piggyback ride. Hisashi didn't even bother knocking before he just kicked open the door, launching himself in and pulling 𝐂𝐿 along behind him. "Where's the babies?" Hisashi yelled as he marched in, thankfully using his normal voice, to the tranquility of the school's budgeting team. Those windows were expensive. "Good evening, Yamada-san," 𝐒𝐻𝑒𝑧 greeted him, unfazed as always by anything that happened in the world. "Aizawa-san, hi." "Babies," 𝐂𝐿 walked up to stand next to him, letting their hands remain locked. "I didn't have time to stop him. I don't believe you would have been able to, anyway," 𝐒𝐻𝑒𝑧 laughed, standing up to walk up to them. "So I gather you saw the flyer." "You mean this one?" Hisashi showed the slip of paper, hastily ripped off the board to make sure no one else saw it. 𝐒𝐻𝑒𝑧 nodded. "You like kids, don't you, Yamada-san?" "I saw in your file you have a lot of siblings, oldest of 5, he answered, puffing his chest proudly. "I've helped my parents take care of them all their lives, since I, kinda left them deaf when I was born and they can't hear them calling," he muttered the last part, scratching his cheek self-consciously. He perked up soon enough. "But enough of that. Baby. Is it Midoriya?" 𝐂𝐿 asked blankly, getting a bewildered look from Hisashi. "What? He's literally the only baby here. It's the only logical conclusion, indeed. Midoriya-san asked me for help regarding Izuku's socialization issues," 𝐒𝐻𝑒𝑧 said, gesturing for them to follow him. He pulled a drawer of his desk open and pulled out a little notepad. "Would you like some tea in the meantime?" "If I drink a single more drop of caffeine my heart will stop," 𝐂𝐿 said. "No thank you." Hisashi grinned. They both sat down when the principal took his own seat opposite them. He hummed, going through the notebook slowly. "Ah, here it is," he cleared his throat. "Midoriya-san is concerned she and Izuku might grow too dependent on each other's presence in the future. While she doesn't want to leave him alone just now, she considers it would be a good idea to have someone else around Izuku to help getting both of them used to being around other people." "Wait, both of them?" 𝐂𝐿 tilted his head. "I thought it was just about the kid." "In part, yes," 𝐒𝐻𝑒𝑧 continued. "The idea is that whoever volunteers will spend study hall hours at the Midoriya residence, playing and interacting with Izuku while Midoriya-san is around doing her own thing, like a supervised playdate." Hisashi clapped his hands. "I've done a lot of those." "The supervising I mean," 𝐒𝐻𝑒𝑧 hummed, writing something down. "If you are interested in taking part on this, you will be given the credits due to study hall automatically. Think of it as some sort of voluntary hero work." He then looked at 𝐂𝐿. "When he's at home, Izuku has meal times, play times, nap time." "I'll do it," 𝐂𝐿 said at the mention of nap time. "A kid can't be that different from a cat, right?" There was a peculiar glint to 𝐒𝐻𝑒𝑧's smile at that. "I wouldn't be able to tell. I try not to spend too much time around cats. You see," he set his notebook down. "In the vein of me being a mouse and all that." Hisashi leaned in to whisper to 𝐂𝐿. "So that's what he is after all." 𝐂𝐿 shrugged. "Well, then, if you're interested, I'm sure Midoriya-san wouldn't mind giving you two a test try for a couple of days. You could start tomorrow. We only have study hall 3 days a week though," 𝐂𝐿 pointed out. "Would that be enough?" 𝐒𝐻𝑒𝑧 nodded. "It's a start. Izuku will also be interacting with students and teachers while living here, This is mostly about him being used to being alone with people other than his mother. 𝐬𝐻𝑜ute and 𝐻𝑖zashi looked at each other, then back to 𝐻𝑒zu, and nodded in unison. The following few minutes were spent with 𝐻𝑒zu confirming their contact information from their files, what experience they might have that could help with kids, while 𝐻𝑖zashi had experience with actual children and 𝐬𝐻𝑜ute had only taken care of cats. 𝐬𝐻𝑜ute also was certified in first aid and CPR, which 𝐻𝑒zu thought was a huge bonus. They also were encouraged to take mental notes of whatever Izuku did or say that could be important for his therapy that 𝐭 or recovery girl would need to know as well. By the time everything was settled, they had missed half their current peer and 𝐬𝐻𝑜ute was ready to murder 𝐻𝑖zashi for making him miss class instead of waiting to the end of the day like a normal person. Luckily, 𝐻𝑖zashi knew exactly what spot behind his ear he should kiss to get instant forgiveness. 𝐭 had just finished placing Izuku in his high chair for lunch when there was a knock on the door. "Izuku, I'm going to the door just here, okay?" she told him slowly, pointing in the direction she would go. Izuku looked at the door, nodding after deciding it was within his sight. She nodded back, kissing his cheek before going to open it. She'd gotten a visit from 𝐻𝑒zu the day before, telling her there had been a couple volunteers for their little idea. He told her everything she needed to know about them. Good students, one of them had a useful quirk in case they needed protection, the other had experience with kids and, most important of all, trustful. She came face to face with a tired-looking boy and an extremely sunny one, and the contrast was enough to make her stop for a second before she smiled widely at them. "Hello. You must be Yamada-kun and Aizawa-kun. 𝐻𝑒zu told me you'd be coming." 𝐻𝑖zashi nodded. "Please, call me 𝐻𝑖zashi," he said, stepping inside after she moved aside to let them through. As he was taking off his shoes, 𝐬𝐻𝑜ute looked down, thinking for a moment before nodding the tiniest bit to himself. "I'm 𝐬𝐻𝑜ute," he copied 𝐻𝑖zashi, moving to swap his own shoes for slippers after 𝐻𝑖zashi was done and had made his way into the living room. 𝐭 closed the door, walking back into the kitchen. Izuku was trying to see who had come in, hands on the little table hauling him up. 𝐭 rushed to make him sit back down. "No, sweetie, you might fall." "Who's that?" Izuku asked, feeling bolder and leaning even more forward with his mother holding the chair still. "Visit." 𝐻𝑖zashi was making a face that told 𝐬𝐻𝑜ute he must have been making some sort of high-pitched noise that must have slipped into 𝐿𝑡𝑎s and 𝑑. "They're students," Izuku 𝐭 explained to him, making sure he was safely sitting down before going to the fridge to pull out his food. "They're in the hero course," Izuku gasped, eyes shining in awe as he looked at the teens who walked closer to avoid Izuku trying to lift himself out of the chair again. "Heroes? Like Midnight?" 𝐻𝑖zashi leaned down. "That's right. You know Midnight, Izuku?" he asked, smiling at the boy. Izuku nodded, tapping around his own face before doing the same to 𝐻𝑖zashi's, touching his specs. "Glasses, like her." 𝐻𝑖zashi took off his frames, the orange-tinted glass casting shadows on his face. Izuku was entranced by the spiral shape of his irises. "You wanna try them on?" The boy nodded frantically, making grabby hands at him. 𝐻𝑖zashi chuckled and set them carefully on Izuku's face. The legs didn't quite hold on his ears and the bridge slipped down his tiny nose, but 𝐻𝑖zashi kept them in place with a finger. Izuku laughed as 𝐻𝑖zashi snapped a pic of him with his phone, showing the child how he looked with them on. 𝐭 had moved to stand by 𝐬𝐻𝑜ute as Izuku's lunch warmed up. Both were watching them interact with twin fond smiles on their faces. "He seems to have it under control," she commented, bringing a hand to her cheek. 𝐬𝐻𝑜ute hummed in agreement. "He's used to it. When he saw the flyer, he literally dragged me to the principal's office." 𝐭 said, "Are you okay being here after all, 𝐬𝐻𝑜ute-kun?" She looked worried. "I wouldn't want you to feel obligated to do something you don't want to." He stared at 𝐻𝑖zashi's grin as he let Izuku ruffle his hair, fascinated by the style. "Nah, I'm good." The microwave beeped then, pulling 𝐭 from their conversation as she took out the bowl and made sure it was not too hot so Izuku wouldn't burn his mouth. He was quite the ravenous eater now that he could stomach a bit more. When the smell of food reached him, Izuku turned away from 𝐻𝑖zashi, looking at his mother with surprised eyes. The newcomers were so interesting he had forgotten what time it was. Then he started making impatient little noses, hitting his palms quickly on the table as she approached with his lunch. 𝐻𝑖zashi moved to the side, letting her set the bowl down. It looked like pured carrots with shredded bits of chicken in between, and it was a really small portion for a kid his size. Izuku knows when he's eaten enough. 𝐿𝐴 answers the unspoken question, scooping a bit of it and blowing on it for good measure before bringing it to Izuku's waiting mouth. She did little noises as she fed him, imitating the opening and closing of his mouth. If he's still hungry, he can always ask for more. Hisashi nodded, taking mental notes of the amount and way she fed him for future reference. He felt 𝐿𝐴's chin hook over his shoulder to watch as well, despite it being much easier to just stand by his side. Sap. Is that his meal plan? 𝐿𝐴 pointed out a slip of paper stuck to the fridge. It was held in place by a cute parrot-shaped magnet. 𝐿𝐴 nodded, waiting for Izuku to finish his most recent spoonful. It changes by the week as we work our way to real solids. She gave him the next scoop. Izuku is very strict with following it, so he can finally be well enough to eat his favorite, right honey? She cooed at him. Izuku swallowed exaggeratedly, the way kids like to do. Katsuden. He raised his arms as he shouted, opening his mouth like a baby bird for the next spoonful. They remained quiet after that, Hisashi looking around the room while 𝐿𝐴 was busy with Izuku, taking note of all the places he could suggest baby-proofing later on. 𝐿𝐴 had stayed, wanting to further analyze the way 𝐿𝐴 fed her son, noting the amount of food she scooped each time, the speed at which she brought it to him, the angle. Would you like to try, 𝐿𝐴-kun? Her voice directed at him made him jump, bringing him out of his thoughts. He blinked at her, looking between her and the child who was also looking at him, expectant of his answer so he could go back to his food. 𝐿𝐴 thrust the spoon in his direction, waiting for him to hesitantly take it before turning to stand next to Izuku, leaving the front of the chair open for him. 𝐿𝐴 got closer, setting a hand on the bowl so it wouldn't topple over as he picked up some of the mash. He carefully blew on it like he'd seen her do and offered the spoon to Izuku. The baby opened wide and snapped his head forward like a hungry hippo, mouth closing and dragging the food into his mouth so suddenly that it almost took the spoon with him out of 𝐿𝐴's hand. 𝐿𝐴 chuckled at the expression on 𝐿𝐴's face, his eyes wide and mouth slightly open in surprise. Stronger than he looks, isn't he? While 𝐿𝐴 did indeed agree with that statement, what truly had gone through his mind at that moment couldn't be more different. Because as he saw Izuku's eyes bright with joy and staring hopefully at him, a bit of carrot on his chin and a smile full of trust directed at him on his chubby freckled cheeks, 𝐿𝐴 felt a repeat of the chill he'd felt so late that one night. An unknown warmth and a need to protect this kid from whatever would hurt him out in this world. And as he went to give the kid the next bit, he told himself to later take Hisashi to his favorite cafe, as thanks for dragging him all the way here. Come here Zuzu, you can do it. Hisashi cheered him on, sitting cross-legged on the floor of the flat. Izuku looked at him from the other side of the room, sitting on his own in front of 𝐿𝐴 who was also sitting as Hisashi was. Izuku looked at them both, turning this way and that so many times one couldn't believe not so long ago he couldn't even lift his head. The soft sound of 𝐿𝐴's humming floated through the room from the kitchen. Izuku fumbled in place, holding himself straight with the grip he had on 𝐿𝐴's knees. He managed to twist his legs under his body and fell into all fours. His all-might honesty protected his knees and feet from rubbing on the carpet as he crawled his way through the floor, the hood covering his head giving 𝐿𝐴 two bright yellow plush bangs to signal his position. Izuku was well on his way to giving his first steps on his own, but Hisashi had suggested he first try crawling to work his muscles before he tried it, and Recovery Girl had agreed. Look at you go, Hisashi said, phone out and recording as he made his way towards him. The camera was at the perfect angle to also catch a nice view of 𝐿𝐴's fond smile as he followed Izuku's progress. Izuku smiled at the praise, giggling as he sped up. His tiny hands slammed down as he pushed forward, letting a final, triumphant laugh as he practically jumped into Hisashi's arms. Hisashi whooped and fell back, picking him up and keeping him up in the air above him. 𝐿𝐴 followed Izuku's example and crawled his way over in a couple of leaps, flopping down next to Hisashi to smile up at the child. That's how they were when there were knocks at the door. I'll get that, 𝐿𝐴 announced, dropping the knife she was using in the sink and wiping her hands on her apron as she bounded for the door. Hisashi and 𝐿𝐴, feeling at home on the floor after their first couple of visits, remained where they were. 𝐿𝐴 opened the door a crack, blinking in surprise and letting it open fully at the sight of Toshinori on the other side. Ah, "Good morning," he greeted, doing a little awkward wave as he noticed the 4 pairs of eyes staring at him. Izuku immediately started wriggling, almost making Hisashi drop him if not for his well-trained reflexes on holding overexcited babies. He was set down gently, and as if fueled by will alone, Izuku shot through the room, crawling at the speed of sound towards the door. 𝐭𝐽 managed to catch him with her quirk before he fell down the step of the Genkan on his way to All Might, and held him up carefully. "Hi!" Izuku waved, looking up at the looming figure of the hero in front of him. He let his hands stay up after he was done waving, looking at Toshinori expectantly. Toshinori stared at the kid, looking confused and, to the 2 teenagers slowly approaching the reunion, infuriatingly taken by the sight of the kid's smile directed at him. 𝐭𝐽 just smiled, glancing meaningfully between Izuku's hand, Toshinori, and Toshinori's hand. It finally dropped on him. "Oh!" He grabbed Izuku's hand carefully between his thumb and index, slowly shaking the little hand in greeting. "Hello to you as well, young Midoriya." Izuku shrieked with laughter, jumping on the seat of his mother's arm in excitement, making the hood of his onesie fall back from his head. The movement caught Toshinori's attention and made him realize what exactly the boy was wearing. Hisashi and 𝐬𝐽 would still have heated arguments the following years about whether 𝐭𝐽 or Toshinori blushed the hardest in that moment. "He's a big fan." 𝐭𝐽 answered the unspoken question, half hiding her face on Izuku's puff of hair. I see. There was a moment where they just stood there, trying way harder than necessary to not look at each other, with Izuku blissfully unaware of everything and still jumping up and down in place. 𝐬𝐽 soon had enough. "Well, are you going to just stand there or ask to come in?" He addressed the hero, smiling smugly when he startled at his words. "Oh, of course." Toshinori cleared his throat, then bowed at the woman in front of him. "Midoriya-san, I actually came here to see you were settling in well." "Ah, yes. Please come in," 𝐭𝐽 said, stepping back to allow him to sit down and take off his shoes, and it was truly a sight how his broad shoulders almost didn't fit in the frame of the hall. 𝐭𝐽 cleared her throat and looked away, hoping the heat on her cheeks could pass off as leftover from the little moment a second ago. Once he was done and they were standing on the same floor level, the height difference that was already huge with All Might standing on the door became utterly ridiculous. He was strolling into the house at a leisurely pace, looking around the room and hunching over himself a bit, as if feeling if he stood up he'd crack a hole into the ceiling, or if he moved too fast he'd crash into a wall. 𝐭𝐽 sat down on the armchair, settling Izuku on her lap as Toshinori sat down on the couch on the spot closest to her. Hisashi and 𝐬𝐽 fell down on the free spots next to the hero, glaring at him like overtrained guard dogs. Toshinori would not admit he felt a little scared. He cleared his throat, sitting straight up but leaning slightly towards the woman. "So, how have you been since moving in? Is everything to your liking here?" 𝐭𝐽 nodded, bouncing her leg to entertain Izuku. "Oh yes, it's all really nice." She pushed Izuku's hair back from his face and held it there, leaving his forehead exposed and making his eyes seem even larger. "We take walks around campus as often as we can. It's a truly appealing place for a school. Students with plant-based quirks are allowed to go wild on school grounds," 𝐬𝐽 added from the side. "Lots of bees though," Hisashi shivered. Bees," Izuku grunted, shaking his mother's hands from his hair and pushing on her arms around him. 𝐭𝐽 was surprised that he was so keen on her letting go of him, but considering what they had been working towards for the last few days to make him less dependent on her, it seemed better to just comply. She carefully opened her arms and Izuku struggled to turn around, letting his legs dangle from her lap as he held onto her knees for support. He let himself drop, to the surprise and concern of his caretakers, but he didn't utter more sound than a little grunt as his legs didn't hold and he ended up sitting on the floor. He shook the shock off and turned to look at Toshinori. The hero was wide-eyed, arms raised as if ready to jump into action the second the boy started crying, but it never came. Instead, Izuku went back to all fours and crawled over to him, holding on tight to his breathed leg and slowly hoisting himself up. As slowly as Hisashi brought his phone up to record everything. It took him a while, ignoring the silence around him as his legs trembled, but Izuku finally managed to stand up on his own, still holding onto Toshinori's jeans as he stared up at the hero, huffing and puffing from the effort. He yanked on the fabric twice. Up Toshinori didn't have to be told twice. "Oh God," Hisashi whispered, silently swapping from recorder to camera and snapping as many pictures per second as he could. The bell chose to ring at that time, signaling the change of PRDIS and the inevitable time for Hisashi and 𝐿𝐴 to leave for their next class. They took turns to shake Izuku's hand and say goodbye to 𝐭 before leaving. Hisashi did say goodbye to All Might, though 𝐿𝐴 merely nodded at him before leaving. Izuku followed them with his eyes until they walked out of the door, waving bye all the while. When the door finally closed, he fixed his big green eyes on Toshinori and smiled wide. Toshinori chuckled, being careful as he ruffled the boy's hair, pushing it back like his mother had done to better see that round little face, and wasn't he just extremely happy to see those cheeks chubby and plump unlike the first time he met him. When the silence stretched on, he looked at 𝐭, surprised to see her staring at Izuku, smiling with a mix of joy and surprise on her face. Her eyes traveled up to meet Toshinori's, and he was taken back at seeing some tears run down her face. "That's the first time he's stood up on his own," she murmured, drying her cheeks with her sleeve, laughing. "Last time I tried he almost broke down. It was a luck he was sitting down, or Toshinori would have dropped the baby from how much that simple statement weighted on him." Izuku seemed content just sitting there on the hero's lap, pulling up his hood and touching the yellow plush bangs that imitated All Might's as he stared up at the real things. He rubbed the kid's back softly, the same way he'd done when taking him out that night at the police station. He checked him quickly to make sure what he was wearing was warm enough and then addressed 𝐭. "Would you like to go on a walk?" All the way through campus, Izuku refused to let go of Toshinori's shirt, and so the hero opted to simply carry him in his arms. They traversed the green plains of campus at a leisurely pace, 𝐭 walking beside Toshinori, a bag slung over her shoulder with everything Izuku could need on the way. Izuku was clutching All Might's shirt with one hand, the thumb of the other stuck in his mouth as he let his awed gaze wander around everything. "So, Nezu tells me he's already planning Izuku's first grade's curriculum," Toshinori said, smiling at the boy laying against him. Izuku was looking up at him, having turned at the mention of his name, and was smooshing his cheek against the hero's chest. "Seems he's excited to start teaching him. He didn't even wait until Izuku is of proper school age. He took into account the time Izuku might need off for therapy in the future if he needs it, and also thought he could be ready to start early, maybe when he turns 5 or so." 𝐭 nodded, smiling at her son as he followed a flock of birds flying in formation on the sky. Izuku has always been very curious, wants to know everything about anything all the time. That's a great trait to have. He pushed the boy's hood back to run his hand through his hair. He seemed almost clinically concerned with Izuku's general well-being, making sure he was gaining weight, that his hair was no longer the dirty and matted mess it was after the rescue, that he could hold himself up with no problem and, most importantly, how he seemed to have no problem being around people. He must have been so lonely down there. "Wanna write?" Izuku said out of nowhere, taking his thumb out of his mouth to make a hand gesture similar to writing, twisting his wrist back and forth. "You want to write? What about?" Toshinori asked, genuinely interested in whatever he had to say. He'd never known of a kid so young who wanted to learn so early. "Heroes." Izuku raised his arms, making Toshinori scramble to fix his hold on him. 𝐭 laughed, laying her hand on Toshinori's arm before she realized what she was doing. She subtly retrieved it before the hero realized she'd done it. Izuku was starting to get interested in heroes before the incident, and after he was saved by all of you, I imagine it must have left an even bigger impression. She sighed, smiling at her son as he imitated the hero fights he'd seen on TV and punched and kicked the air in front of him. "I'm sure he'll have a lot of fun with so many heroes in training here. There are a lot of practical classes from the hero course you can join if you want to watch." "We can," Izuku shouted, his voice carrying up and reaching the classrooms nearby. Some students peeped through the windows, snickering. "Can we?" 𝐭 hummed, bringing a hand to her cheek. "Well, we could always ask." Izuku cheered at her answer, even if it was just a possibility and not a certainty. He was just so excited about any kind of hero. The air was starting to heat up from the merciless way the sun beat down on them, and 𝐭 pulled out a juice pouch from her bag, stabbing the straw through before handing to Izuku, who took it carefully to not drop anything on him or All Might. "So how long will you be staying here? A hero of your caliber, I'm sure you're much more needed in bigger cities." 𝐭 asked him, pulling out a little green cap to place on Izuku's head to protect his face from the sun. It popped up a bit from how thick his hair was. Toshinori scratched his cheek, his one hand more than enough to hold Izuku on its own. I don't really now. I'm still involved in the investigation and we don't know how much there is yet to find. Might be a while. He stopped at a cross between walkways, choosing to turn right towards a patch of garden that had a peculiar bunch of bushes in bloom. 𝐭𝐴 followed him wordlessly. And even if I left soon, I'd still be back at some point or another, most likely. How come? Well, I can't really go into detail, he said. But for personal reasons I might take a more personal involvement with UA in the future. He stopped in front of the bushes, checking to make sure there were no wild animals or sharp thorns before kneeling on the grass and setting Izuku down as well, the boy looking in wonder at the colorful flowers around him as he sipped at his juice. Who knows? I might even become a teacher. He laughed at his own words, shaking his head as if it was a funny joke. 𝐭𝐴 tilted her head. Really? You teach here? She'd sit down on a boulder covered in vines, keeping an eye on Izuku as well as Toshinori. He suddenly felt at a loss for words. Well, I'm not sure I could really do it. My experience is mostly practical. I wouldn't know how to put it in words. He smiled as Izuku set down his now empty juice pouch, crawling to one of the bushes and picking a red flower with curly petals to bring back to his mother. But the way I see it, everyone has something to teach. 𝐭𝐴 thanked Izuku for the flower, placing it in her half bun to make sure it would be visible to him she was wearing it and where it wouldn't fall off easily. She followed him with her eyes as he started fiddling with the vines on the boulder, tangling and untangling them over and over again. Everyone, you say? Toshinori hummed. We all have different knowledge we can pass on. It's just a matter of finding the right time and place. 𝐭𝐴 remained quiet, and both adults spent the rest of the evening watching Izuku play around the garden. A home economics class? 𝐒𝐿 asked, regarding the woman in front of him curiously. 𝐭𝐴 nodded, Izuku fast asleep on her lap. I keep thinking about how much you're doing for us, and I can't help feeling like I should be thanking you somehow. Nonsense. It's my pleasure to have you safe. He waved her off, taking her empty cup to refill it with more tea from his ever-present, seemingly unending thermos. You can just focus on doing what you want to make your life here as comfortable as possible. She shook her head. But that's exactly it. I would feel much more comfortable if I knew I was giving something back to the school. Everyone here has been so wonderful to us. 𝐒𝐿 hummed. This idea 𝐭𝐴 was bringing him, that of her trying out teaching a home econ class since she had the knowledge as a mother and previous housewife, he couldn't help rationalize the pros and cons of it. Cons: the only available hours currently were study halls. Most students actually used that time to catch up on homework or study for tests and, in some cases, sleep. They might not be happy to have that time cut off and replaced with even more class. And if they were to implant this class to hero course, the only way to fit everyone would be to have classes 1A and 1B share a PRD, which was complicated with the eternal rivalries those two classes seemed to have generation after generation. Luckily the management course students were perfectionists enough, they most definitely already knew everything this kind of class could offer, so that was one class less to worry about. Pros: 𝐒𝐿 has seen personally how pro heroes lived. If the public knew he'd seen up and close how the #1 hero used a dirty shirt as a napkin, there would be riots on the streets. And heavens knew when was the last time any of the support students ate an actual fruit. It was a wonder none of them had died of scurvy yet. Tell you what, Midoriya-san, he set the cup down on the table. Let's give it a try. Winter vacations are coming soon and the students will come back a bit more relaxed. We could do a test run of home econ with the time they have left before the school year ends in March. 𝐭𝐴's face split with a hopeful smile. Really? That sounds perfect. 𝐒𝐿 smiled at her enthusiasm. He might have a personal reason for his soft spot for Izuku, but this woman had easily made her way into his heart as well. It's worth a shot. His smile dimmed a bit. However, you might have to figure out what to do with Izuku in the meantime. Her smile fell. She hadn't thought of that. Well, 𝐿𝐴 and 𝐵𝐴. I guess they would be taking the class as well, so they wouldn't be able to look after him. She brought her thumb to her mouth, biting her nail. And a kitchen with so many burners and knives is a danger to a child his age. Well, there's still a couple of weeks until classes are over for Christmas. We can figure it out, I'm sure, he reassured her, flashing her one of his rare genuinely warm smiles. Every problem has a solution, or else it wouldn't be a problem. 𝐒𝐭 smiled at his words, nodding in agreement. We'll work it out. Nezu didn't expect the problem would work itself out just a couple of hours later. Yamada-san, I'll have to ask you to stop kicking my door open, he said calmly as the loud teenager barged into his office, Aizawa marching in behind him. Both looked equally determined, to his surprise. We're not gonna stop babysitting Izuku. New class or not, Hisashi said, a no-nonsense tone to his words. 𝐬𝐽 nodded along. You said babysitting would give us our credits for the hours we missed. Why not keep that up for home econ? 𝐬𝐽 added, Hisashi nodding his agreement this time. Nezu tapped his fingers on his desk. You seriously are not interested in partaking in this class? I have been helping my parents with everything in the house since my first sister was born. There's little more I could learn, Hisashi answered. You could teach me to prepare a wedding banquet and I'd still live off of coffee and instant noodles. It's a futile effort, 𝐬𝐽 added. Babe, futile, Zashi, Nezu hummed, paws clasped in front of his mouth. He considered the two students in front of him. They'd come of their own volition to talk to him, most likely immediately after getting the news from 𝐒𝐭. 𝐬𝐽 was even. Risking being late to class again for this. They were the real deal. Alright, he said. I'll allow it, you can't force us to. Wait, what? Hisashi stopped himself from his rant, blinking in surprise at the principal. Nezu smiled at them. You two might very well be the most hard-headed students currently in this school. And I know adding Izuku into the mix will just make it harder to convince you otherwise, so I'll just cut the chase short and let you have this, 𝐬𝐽 sighed relieved, grasping Hisashi's hand to calm himself. He was way more nervous than he'd like to showcase. He'd gotten way too attached to Izuku in the few days they'd spent with him for it to just be over so soon. However, Nezu continued. Know that this means you have until class starts again after winter break to convince Izuku to be alone with you too. Without his mother, the couple thought, that was another hurdle to jump. We can work it out, Hisashi assured him. I've been talking to Recovery Girl about Izuku's rehab when waiting for 𝐬𝐽 to wake up when he gets knocked out in heroics. 𝐬𝐽 grumbled, pulling at his hand but not letting go. Hisashi continued. Plus we can come in during break, no biggie. Nezu looked at 𝐬𝐽, who nodded to confirm his words. My parents have no problem with me being wherever for Christmas and New Year's. I've spent it with Hisashi the last couple of years anyway, and my family can survive without me for a few days. The house won't crumble if I'm not there, Hisashi grinned, then gave it a second thought. I think, alright, I guess that's settled then, Nezu said, clapping his hands. I'll leave it to you. I'm sure you can make Izuku happy with what limited time you have. There was something threatening hiding in that sentence, but none of them could identify it. It only made it more terrifying. For the next 3 weeks they not only spent their usual allotted time with Izuku, but also an hour or so after class every day as well. It came to the point where 𝐒𝐭 would just make them lunch so they could also spend that hour with her son, seeing how they tried to stretch the time they had as much as possible. It was good to see Izuku so distracted, eagerly awaiting for them to arrive day after day. He'd somehow learned to tell what time it was and would go sit by the door on his own a few minutes before they actually knocked, and would jump on his seat as he waited for his mother to open the door. Sometimes All Might would be there as well, joining the students in their visit so he wouldn't feel so imposing on his own. During those times he had to withstand the glares of the teenagers, since Izuku's attention was solely focused on him and 𝐒𝐭. Don't get it wrong, they were forever thankful to him for having rescued the boy, but God. They had started working on Izuku's walking, having found nothing else to work on regarding crawling that would advance his therapy. They would take turns, kneeling in front of him and holding his hands, moving back with every step Izuku took forward. They found out Izuku would always walk faster and easier if they positioned themselves in such a way it made him walk towards 𝐒𝐭. He could follow an easy rhythm of a couple of steps before he had to stop and regain his footing, sometimes overdoing it and falling to his knees. He didn't cry, just huffed and waited until his legs could respond again to stand up with his babysitter's help. And sometimes some more people helped too. It had been just the beginning of the second week when a quick and persistent knocking on the door made everyone in the house jump. School had let out merely 20 minutes ago and Hisashi was in the middle of a serious doodling competition with Izuku. Shouta was the impartial judge, which meant he automatically decided Izuku won every single time, when the noise startled them. Who could that be? Nezu and Toshinori never come at this hour, 𝐒𝐭 mumbled to herself, cup of coffee left on the table as she went to the door. Shouta and Hisashi couldn't see who it was from their angle, but the shrill laugh that left 𝐒𝐭 had them on their feet as fast as if it had been a screaming civilian during a villain attack. The intruder, they found out, was none other than their own classmate. Nemirai was hugging the woman like someone would a friend they haven't seen in forever, 𝐒𝐭 hugging her back and laughing at her enthusiasm. Nemirai, can you find a hobby other than scaring me to death? Hisashi shouted at her, pointing at her with a red crayon. You don't get to talk to me. She yelled right back. Didn't even let me know about spending time with Izuku like the hoarder you are. Please let's not make a scene. A placating voice came from behind her, and just now did Shouta and Hisashi realize Tensai had come as well. Nemirai pouted, but then grinned and pulled him further in. Midoriya-san, this is Ida Tensai. He might be around as much as me, so I brought him to meet you. She planted him firmly in front of the woman to let him introduce himself, and then let herself into the house. She made a beeline for Izuku, pushing Shouta out of the way and into the couch. Izuku noticed her before she reached him. He gasped, kneeling and raising his arms to be picked up. Midnight. Izuku-un. She swooped him in her arms, twirling around as he giggled hysterically. I missed you so much, be careful, he just ate, Shouta warned her, hands raised as if wanting to snatch him out of her arms. She stuck her tongue out at him, Izuku imitating her and managing to make it look downright illegally cute. You too, traitor. I was wondering why you two had been disappearing during lunch hour, she said. I thought it was something more spicy, but I guess you two are too vanilla for that, Nemirai. All three of her classmates called out, Hisashi moving to cover Izuku's ears as his own turned a deep red. Shouta don't like spicy food, Izuku said casually, not bothered by Hisashi's hands around his head. Because he's an old man, Nemirai nodded, eyes closed as if preaching some hard truths. You're older than us, woman. 𝐒𝐭 walked back to her seat, chuckling at the antics of the kids in her living room. She loved the noise they were making, the way Izuku's eyes drifted from one to another, how lively they made the room seem. They all ended up sitting in a circle on the floor, Nemirai joining the doodle battle against Hisashi while Izuku made his way onto the cradle of Tensai's legs, ready to make a new friend. Tensai had been understandably nervous about interacting with the child after knowing all his story, but was delighted to find Izuku reached for him first. He was really curious about his eyebrows and his quirk, looking at the pipes in awe as Tensai brought them closer for him to explore at his own pace. Can you fly? Izuku asked, moving his arms up and down in a cartoonish flying motion. Tensai laughed. I mean, I can propel myself up in one spot, or spin around. He did a twirling motion with his finger. Mostly I use them to run faster. My little brother has the same engines in his legs. You have a brother, Ida-kun? 𝐒𝐭 asked, listening to get to know the team better as well. Tensai nodded. His name's Tenya. His Izuku's age, 𝐒𝐭 hummed, taking a sip of her coffee. I see, she said, guessing he felt he could get along with her son from his own experience with his brother. The same way Hisashi did, and he and Izuku were thick as thieves in such a short time. Shouta had been more of a case of affection at first sight, but he was doing a great job nonetheless. 𝐒𝐭 got up, walking to the kitchen. I'll bring you some snacks. Izuku, what would you like? Jelly. She nodded, moving around the kitchen as she heard them interact with her son. Nemirai was loudly announcing her victory over Hisashi in the drawing competition, claiming the only one with the skills to beat her was Izuku. The kid giggled, followed by the sound of rustling paper as he joined the battle, loudly describing what every line and color was supposed to be. To no one's surprise, he was drawing All Might. Naomasa let the folder drop back down on his desk, sighing in frustration. This had to be the first time in his admittedly short career that a case had so much information, yet so little at the same time. The amount of people that had been arrested during the raid in All for One's lab was staggering, including the main man himself. Yet, the information they'd been able to recover was minimal, and there was no way of recovering it since most hard drives had been melted to the ground by the time they'd gotten to them. It was a curious thing, how despite having interrogated every person who'd been working at the lab, none of them said anything, not out of loyalty to the villain or stillbornness, but because they genuinely seemed to have no idea what they'd been doing there, nor how they'd gotten there. Almost as if they'd had their memories wiped the moment they'd been taken into the precinct. One of the man's many quirks, no doubt. The only people who could tell proper information about what had been going on in there were the villain himself and, to Naomisa's increasing headache, Izuku. The kid had been in a cage, locked away from the world for months, not knowing what was going on, yet he still had witnessed more than any of the officers could extract from the scientists' minds with whatever interrogation technique or memory recovering quirk they had at hand. Like, for example, what had been in those empty cages surrounding Izuku's. What experiments were they conducting? What did they need from Izuku that they'd taken so much BLD from him to the point he'd been bordering on fatal anemia by the time they'd rescued him, the puncture wounds on his arms forever scarred on his skin? Asking him, however, was another thing altogether. Izuku had panic attacks triggered by certain environments or sounds that reminded him of his captivity, still had nightmares and needed a bright nightlight to sleep according to 𝐒𝐭, and there was the chance his mind had blocked most of the traumatic events to protect itself. He was seeing a therapist once a week to try and pry as much as they could from him, but the therapist preferred to go slow and let Izuku talk and play during these sessions, trying to sneak keywords in their conversations to try and force some useful information out of what Izuku would answer subconsciously. They wouldn't try to force any memories out of him until he was old enough to deal with them properly, even with the therapist's mind mapping quirk. The only thing they could somewhat use out of that lab had been a mechanical chair designed to strap whoever was sitting down on it tight enough to prevent all movement, with attachments of glass bulbs made to hook up to whoever was in the chair, most definitely to administer and collect fluids to and from the subjects. Izuku's DNA had been found everywhere in that chair, among what had to be hundreds of other sets of people who were now confirmed to be the other people kidnapped by the same black goo. All of them missing. A knock on his door brought him back to reality, giving them the go-ahead to come in. Toshinori's face appeared through the door, followed by the rest of him along with the most appealing sight Naomisa had seen all day, 2 humongous, steaming cups of coffee. "Where do you want our wedding to be?" he said in lieu of a greeting, practically inhaling the coffee as soon as he was handed it. Toshinori laughed. "If you keep proposing to me each time I bring you caffeine, I might just take you up on that, you know," Naomisa hummed from behind his cup, sighing contently when it burned his tongue. "I'm not dyeing my hair green though," he muttered. "What?" "Nothing." The detective wheeled his chair around, getting up to put back the file on the shelf behind him. "Any new leads on the case?" Toshinori frowned. "We've caught a couple of lesser villains who seem to have heard of the lab, but nothing more about it." He shook his head. "Seems everyone involved has already been caught, but we can't be too sure. All for One didn't keep records of who he brainwashed to work for him, so we can't be sure if there's anyone else out there." Naomisa walked around to the front of his desk, leaning against it. "And there's still the matter of the fate of the other kidnappees. Considering what they'd easily done to a 2-year-old child, Naomisa almost felt guilty hoping they were gone for good and not somewhere else, having even more gruesome experiments done on them. How long have you been working now? Did you get any sleep at all last night?" Toshinori asked him, eyeing the amount of used coffee filters and chocolate envelopes in the trash can. "I think I passed out for a couple of seconds when I sneezed." Naomisa grinned, the smile not quite reaching the bags under his eyes. He sighed at the look Toshinori sent him. "All right, I guess I can take a break. Distract me, or something." "You're too young to be working so much," Toshinori mumbled, thinking how fast Naomisa had rose through the police ranks at the mere age of 23. He was gonna look older than Toshinori himself if he kept it up. "Well, I went to visit the Midoriyas the other day." "Yeah." Izuku managed to stand up on his own, he said, a smile on his face as he remembered the moment, and how much joy had flooded his chest at the words of 𝐒𝐭 about it being the first time he did it. He looked so much better every passing day. His mother, too, seems to have found a bit of peace in you. Naomisa remembered the warm welcome they'd gotten from the students when they'd been introduced, and Nezu's frequent updates on their situation, including a specific group of third years who had taken a personal interest in the family. Midnight would even pop into his office to say hi during her patrols and gush about Izuku like she got paid for it. It helped him feel better to know at least this one person rescued had been living his best life after going through so much. Well, Toshinori stood up, downing the last of his own cup in one go and tossing it into the trash bin. I better go. I promised Izuku I would accompany them to see some practical classes up close. My Doria-san is going too. Naomasa asked, raising an eyebrow. Toshinori nodded, his trademark grin splitting his face. They both love heroes, it will be a good distraction for them to see some in action, Naomasa hummed, nodding at the hero as he left the office with a skip on his step. He shook his head, sitting back down to keep working. Absolutely clueless, I swear Izuku didn't know where to look at. Everywhere he turned there were amazing battle moves and quirks being thrown around with a grace he didn't know was possible. He was particularly interested in the battles where his friends were involved, laughing when Nemurai's quirk sent down not only her opponent but everyone else around her. Gasping when 𝐿𝐴𝐼 accidentally got tangled in his own capture weapon while erasing the other's quirk. Yelling in amazement at the speed Tensai reached and how he practically flew through the field. Giggling when the aftershock of Hisaashi's scream made the stands tremble. He was, once again, sitting on All Might's lap. His mother sat next to the hero, just as immersed in the training exercise as her son. Toshinori found it adorable how their expressions mirrored each other as they ate and oohed. Inko was as much of a fan as Izuku, it seemed. Go 𝐿𝐴𝐼! Izuku yelled, raising his arms when 𝐿𝐴𝐼 finally managed to send his scarf to wrap around his opponent to immovilize him. Win! They sure are good at this, Inko commented, eyes scanning over the gym. I can already see them out in the streets for the real thing. All of them already have their provisional licenses, so they've had quite the amount of real-life experience, Toshinori agreed, his hold on Izuku careful as he leaned forward. They'll be great heroes. I know. There was a moment of quiet during a partner swap, Hisashi going against Nemurai while 𝐿𝐴𝐼 stood in front of another girl, this one with massive horns protruding through her hair, her body perfectly trained so her neck muscles could hold the extra weight. When the exercise started anew, 𝐿𝐴𝐼 started dodging left and right and only using his capture weapon, never once activating his quirk as she charged against him. She's really fast, Inko wondered, trying to guess how much those horns must weigh and the strain they must put on her. Toshinori nodded. One wouldn't think that just looking at her quirk at first glance, right? All quirks have limitations and negative secondary effects. The best heroes are those that learn to work with them despite it. You as well? Inko asked teasingly, nudging him slightly. He laughed, scratching his cheek. Well, I wouldn't be the number one hero if I revealed any weakness I might or might not have, would I? Inko hummed, not really expecting an answer. To her and to everyone else looking at All Might, his quirk was perfect. Never a lost battle, never a serious wound, always jumping from one villain to the next without a second thought. It was hard to imagine the man to have any weaknesses. The battles kept going for a while, with Izuku much quieter than at the beginning. He'd only gasp or clap when something really interesting happened, but didn't really speak much. Inko assumed it was because he was tired, but Izuku had fallen asleep in Toshinori's arms a couple of times already with no problem, so she didn't want to bother him with taking him away from the action and back home. If he wanted to sleep, he would just lay back and close his eyes. The class was wrapping up now, Cementos checking the damage in the training grounds while the homeroom teacher decided which students could just go change and who needed a visit to Recovery Girl. Luckily all four of Izuku's friends were in good condition and could just go back for lunch. Inko called them over to the stands, telling them all to come to her place to eat after they were done changing. Nemurai immediately accepted in name of all of them and dragged them off with her. Izuku hadn't fallen asleep like Inko had thought. He had remained in Toshinori's arms all the way back home, but he still was really quiet. He was picking at his clothes, pulling at his sleeves and overall just looking completely lost in his own thoughts. He didn't even realize he was being put down until he sunk in. The soft cushions of the couch, snapping his head up in surprise as he noticed where they were. He didn't hear what his mother had said to him, but as she turned the TV on to some colorful cartoon, he assumed she must have asked him to sit there for a bit, since she then kissed his forehead and made her way to the kitchen to presumably make lunch. All Might ruffled his hair and followed Inko, insisting on helping her. Izuku still wasn't all that there, but he giggled when his mother looked at the hero sharply, asking him if he was sure he wanted to help. 1 year later and he was decked in 𝐭𝐽𝐻's most fabulous yellow apron, too small for him and completely missing any coverage that would make wearing an apron practical. She also had him put on a bandana to keep his bangs out of the way, and it was like that how the 4 teenagers found him peeling potatoes once they arrived. "Oh my god," Tensai muttered, drowned by the hysterical laugh of 𝐵𝐻𝐻, 𝐵𝐻𝐻 blatantly pulling out his phone to record the incriminating evidence against the hero. "Welcome back." 𝐭𝐻 greeted them, showing her matching green apron bandana combo as she leaned into view of the teens. "We'll be done in a few minutes, please sit down wherever you want." 𝐵𝐻𝐻 went to plop down next to Izuku, letting Hisashi and 𝐶H𝐿TA wrestle each other on who got to sit on the boy's other side, while Tensai went the peaceful route and chose the armchair. 𝐶H𝐿TA finally won with a well-placed lock on Hisashi's arm, leaving him no other option than the floor as he pouted and crossed his arms after his defeat. "Izuku, did you see me fight today?" 𝐵𝐻𝐻 asked, leaning forward to rest her arms on her knees and be at level with Izuku. "I was better than these dummies, wasn't I? Can you call it a fight if you put everyone to sleep without lifting a finger?" Hisashi scoffed, scooting forward to drop his chin on the couch, smiling when Izuku started playing with his hair now that he was closer. "You're just mad you were no match for me." "Well, she's right," Tensai interfered. "Regardless of the method, if your quirk can help bring villains down and save people it counts as a victory." 𝐶H𝐿TA raised a hand towards them, eyes focused on Izuku. "Guys, can you keep quiet for a moment?" The other 3 looked at him in surprise. Usually 𝐶H𝐿TA just left them talk a mile a minute while he hummed or nodded or just straight up fell asleep, but this was the first time he actively told them to shut up. They followed his gaze and landed on Izuku. The kid looked constipated, hands clutching his breathes and mouth twisted into a painful frown. He was shaking. "Izuku?" 𝐵𝐻𝐻 asked softly, running a thumb over his cheek but finding no tears to wipe. "Are you feeling all right, honey?" Tensai had gone to fetch 𝐭𝐻 and Toshinori, both worriedly hurrying to stand in front of the boy. 𝐭𝐻 knelt in front of Izuku, pulling his hands away from the death grip they had on his clothes to squeeze them in her own. "Baby, what's wrong?" she asked, touching his forehead to check if he was feverish. "Does your tummy hurt?" Izuku opened his mouth, but nothing came out. He closed it and opened it over and over again, little half-choked noises filling the silence of the room as he tried to speak through the lump in his throat. He finally got out. "Can I?" "Can you what, Izuku?" Toshinori asked him softly, placing a hand on 𝐭𝐻's shoulder as he leaned down as well to better hear the thread of a voice the kid could manage to let out. Izuku looked at him, and it seemed it somehow made it worse. Something in his eyes looked on the brink of shattering. "Can I be a hero too?" 𝐭𝐻 almost reared back as if slapped, but held herself firm. It would do Izuku no good to see her react like that. "Baby! What do you mean, Zuzu?" "Of course you can," Hisashi said, brows furrowed in confusion. "But I don't," Izuku said, stopping halfway to swallow. "Don't have one?" 𝐭𝐻 let out a shaky breath, her hands trembling, but she refused to let go of her son. 𝐶H𝐿TA looked at her and then at Izuku, easily putting 2 and 2 together just from context and their reactions. "You don't have a quirk?" he asked softly. Izuku turned to look at him, lip trembling as he shook his head. Tensai frowned. "But you're still too young, you couldn't possibly know." "The doctors confirmed it," 𝐭𝐻 interrupted him. They figured it out while he was gone." She clenched her teeth, trying to keep her anger in check at remembering how sad her baby had been when he first told them. "His quirkless," Izuku whimpered, trying to shrink in on himself to hide from everyone. He'd been so tired still from the hospital that, after the clinical confirmation, it just never occurred to him to bring it up again. Not until he saw the practical classes today and All Might and his mother had started talking about how great heroes they would be with their quirks. It was every child's dream to become a hero, but without a quirk. "That's dumb." Everyone turned to look at 𝐿TA, the tired teen frowning as he stared back only at Izuku, the boy blinking at him with surprise in his green eyes. "I didn't think you could be a dummy," 𝐒𝐻𝐿TA continued, ignoring Hisashi hissing his name in warning. Izuku stayed still for a second, then shook his head. "Not a dummy," 𝐿TA shook his head as well. "No, you're not. That's why I can't understand why you'd even ask something like that, he said. Of course you can be a hero without a quirk. 𝐿𝐭, who had been ready to stop him right there, was left speechless with her mouth open, words ready to make it out but never doing so. Did you see me fight today? 𝐿𝐭 asked Izuku, waiting for the boy to nod. Do you know what my quirk is? What it does? It takes quirks away, Izuku mumbled. It erases them, 𝐿𝐭 nodded. I can erase quirks I come across as long as I'm looking at the person who owns it. Now, did you see when I fought a girl with big horns? Yes. Did I use my quirk on her? Izuku thought for a moment, then shook his head. He'd noticed 𝐿𝐭's quirk turned his eyes red and made his hair float. He didn't do that at all during that match. I knew you were smart, 𝐿𝐭 grinned, ruffling the boy's head and making him giggle, making everyone around let out a sigh of relief at hearing that twinkling laugh again. I didn't use my quirk on her because she has a mutant-type quirk. She can't activate or deactivate it, it's just how she is all the time, he continued. My quirk doesn't let me erase mutant quirks, so when I fight someone like that, I'm as good as quirkless. Izuku's head snapped up, looking at him with newfound awe. He carefully slipped his hands away from his mother's and turned around to crawl over to 𝐿𝐭, sitting on his lap and clutching his uniform's jacket tightly as he stared up at the teen. 𝐿𝐭 waited until he was settled down to keep going. Having a quirk is a huge advantage, yes, and it's true there has never been a quirkless hero, but having a quirk doesn't automatically make you a great fighter or give you a proper sense of justice. A true hero works from the heart, not their quirks. His voice had turned unbearably soft towards the end, his words directed solely to Izuku as the boy looked at him like he'd hung the moon. 𝐿𝐭 smiled at him, a tender look on his face as he ran his fingers through Izuku's hair. I think you'd make a great hero. He looked up then, glancing meaningfully at 𝐿𝐭 and making Izuku look at her as well, his shining eyes paralyzing her to her spot. She smiled too, wiping a single stray tear from her cheek. Of course, she agreed. Of course you can be a hero, Izuku. This time it was Izuku's turn to smile, and it was as blinding as ever. Hisashi offered to finish whatever 𝐿𝐭 and Toshinori had been cooking before they got distracted, knowing after the emotional meltdown they just had Izuku would want his mother with him, and he didn't particularly feel like sharing a tiny kitchen with the Hulk of All Might. Izuku started interrogating 𝐿𝐭 as soon as he'd calmed back down, asking him absolutely everything regarding his quirk and how it worked, and most importantly how he did it to fight around that floor with mutant-type quirks. He was also interested in the scarf he wore in battle, and how he controlled it. That one not even 𝐿𝐭 could explain. It's a support item that helps me capture villains, he explained. I'm still learning how to use it, since it's an experimental item and didn't came with instructions. I also have to do a lot of physical training to keep up with stronger enemies. So fast, Izuku breathed out, remembering how 𝐿𝐭 could jump around the place like nobody's business. Like a ninja, 𝐿𝐭 blushed at the comparison, lamenting not being allowed to wear his scarf with his uniform to have somewhere to hide. He'd have to invest in something that could allow him an easy escape in the future, like a sleeping bag or something. I could teach you when you're older, you know. Izuku jumped, standing on 𝐿𝐭's knees. Really? To be fast? Fast and strong, 𝐿𝐭 said, after looking at 𝐿𝐭 for confirmation and waiting for her approving nod. But not now, maybe after you start school. It's when most kids start training anyway. Aren't heroes need to eat well to be big and strong? Hisashi sing-songed as he popped back in, a tray in his hands holding a little bowl and 2 plates. He'd already set the table and moved Izuku's high chair to the head of it, and waited for 𝐿𝐭 to pick up the child and set him on his chair before setting down the bowl in front of him. Looked like mashed potatoes and scrambled egg for him today. He gestured for 𝐿𝐭 and 𝐿𝐭 to sit down as well, and set down the other 2 plates in front of them, pecking 𝐿�'s cheek before skipping away to pick his own food. 𝐿� grumbled and flushed, but Hisashi couldn't help himself after seeing that little sweet moment he'd had with Izuku just a while ago. Nemurai, Tensai, and Toshinori looked at Hisashi expectantly, standing around like waiting baby birds. Hisashi raised an eyebrow at them, walking past to sit next to 𝐿�. "Y'all broke your hands or something? Rude." Nemurai huffed, stomping to the kitchen with the other 2 defeated men in tow. And when Izuku kept glancing at him with those wide eyes of his between the bites his mother fed him, 𝐤𝐻𝐻 felt like getting 𝐒𝐿𝐵 used to being alone with them would be easier than they thought. That's it, sweetie, just put it right at the top. 𝐒𝐿𝐵's tongue poked out of his mouth as he tried to drop the star on top of the tree while his mother held him up. 𝐭𝐼𝐿's family has never been one to celebrate Christmas with much fanfare, and Hisoshi had always been working during the holidays, so it wasn't like she had to worry about putting up decorations or such. Last year 𝐒𝐿𝐵 had been too young to really understand what was happening during that date, only caring about the shining lights decorating the trees around town and the chiming of bells being carried by the wind. This year, however, would be a Christmas 𝐒𝐿𝐵 would remember, his first one, and while it wasn't a required holiday for them to celebrate, she'd been asked by all of 𝐒𝐿𝐵's friends if they could pop by on Christmas Eve to spend the day with them and bring 𝐒𝐿𝐵 some presents. 𝐭𝐼𝐿 couldn't tell them no. The decorations were sparse and generic, provided last minute by Nezu once 𝐭𝐼𝐿 casually mentioned it in passing conversation that same day, and he even apologized at how simple they were, despite having managed to somehow get them in a day where no store should have any in stock, but they were enough to bring color and light to the house. Her favorite part had been cooking, however. She really enjoyed the mechanic movements and focused the process required of her, and how it made time fly while 𝐒𝐿𝐵 sat on his chair on the other side of the kitchen counter, drawing on his notebook with the warmth of the lit fireplace keeping them cozy. 𝐒𝐿𝐵 finally dropped the star and it fell on the tree, missing the tip and stumbling down to catch on a branch a couple of levels below. "Oi!" 𝐭𝐼𝐿 huffed a laugh, bringing 𝐒𝐿𝐵 down on a tight hug. "That looks perfect, baby. It's a special and unique star, just like you," she said, bopping his nose and making him giggle. There was a knock on the door and she hurried to open it, 𝐒𝐿𝐵 making little hup-hup noises with every step she took. Toshinori stood outside, decked in a light sweater since he quite literally lived just next door. He was carrying a huge store-bought cake in his hands and an equally large plastic bag hung from his elbow. "All might!" 𝐒𝐿𝐵 shouted, as if seeing the hero for the first time instead of their almost everyday encounters. "Hello 𝐒𝐿𝐵," he grinned at the boy in lieu of his usual hair-ruffling greeting since his hands were busy. He turned a gentler smile at 𝐭𝐼𝐿. "Good evening, my Dorian. Come in," she hurried him, laughing when he almost stumbled on his way in. "And I told you already to call me just 𝐿𝐵, Toshinori." Yes, he conceded, setting the cake down on the kitchen and fishing something out of the plastic bag. "It just feels so personal. I've been calling you by your name for a while now," she waved him off, sitting 𝐒𝐿𝐵 down by the Christmas tree where he'd busied himself trying to detangle some extra lights they didn't hang. "I think it's time for you to do so as well, neighbor." Toshinori could never get over how this small, young woman whom he'd met crying her heart out looking for her missing son had somehow been hiding this playful side of her that she liked to use to tease him during nearly all his visits. It was refreshing to be treated like just another acquaintance, another friend by someone. "I'll do my best then, 𝐿𝐵," she grinned at him, nodding as she snatched the cake and put it in the fridge for later. Toshinori had grabbed a hold of what he'd been looking for and took it out of the bag, walking towards the tree 𝐒𝐿𝐵 was sitting by. "𝐒𝐿𝐵," he called the boy, kneeling down next to him once he had his attention. He showed him the wrapped gift box he'd taken out. "I brought you this for Christmas, but you have to wait until midnight to open it, alright?" 𝐒𝐿𝐵 looked at the present in awe, the bright red and white wrapping paper illuminated by the flickering lights. He nodded frantically while Toshinori set it down under the tree, and then giggled when the hero took out a second, slightly smaller but equally appealing gift and set it next to the other. "And this is for your mother, but shish, don't tell her yet." He brought a finger to his lips, winking at the boy. 𝐒𝐿𝐵 covered his smile with both hands, nodding at the request. "Toshinori, could you help me set the table? The kids will be here soon," 𝐭𝐼𝐿 called from the kitchen. He pinched 𝐒𝐿�'s cheek gently before standing back up to do what 𝐭𝐼𝐿 had asked him. "Let's see, it should be 6 places plus 𝐒𝐿�'s chair, right?" He wondered as he went where 𝐭𝐼𝐿 pointed him to fetch plates and cutlery. She shook her head. 8 places, actually. Tensai said he'd bring his little brother, so he and 𝐒𝐿𝐵 will seat together. "Nezu got me a couple of seat boosters for them," she said, pointing at the table. There were indeed 2 chairs with booster seats strapped in, one blue and one green, that Toshinori hadn't noticed. "I see. Is he around 𝐒𝐿�'s age, then?" "Just a month younger," apparently 𝐒𝐿𝐵 said, following after him with a tray of glasses. Since they're a family of heroes, they need to be extra careful with their children in case any villains want to get at them, so he's been a bit sheltered, and Tensai thought Izuku could do with a friend his age as well. He hummed, letting her set the tray down on the table to help her place them properly. Izuku gave a shout of victory from behind them as he detangled his first knot from the lights. If he's anything like young Ida, then Izuku could be looking forward to a very good friend. That's what I thought too. A new knocking at the door interrupted their conversation, and Toshinori offered to go this time. This way he witnessed firsthand how Hisashi's smile fell and Shouter's neutral expression turned to a frown when they saw it was him and not 𝐭𝐽 welcoming them. Nemurai pushed them aside and walked in first, patting All Might's arm as she went past him. "Merry Christmas!" she greeted loudly, sweeping Izuku up in her arms. "And here I have the best present under the tree all for myself." Izuku let the lights fall from his hands, hugging Nemurai tight in return. "Midnight. Open present now," he said, looking over Nemurai's shoulder at Toshinori. The hero couldn't believe Izuku was trying to play him like that. "Not that kind of midnight, Izu." A new tiny voice made itself known from behind Shouter and Hisashi as they walked in as well, right by Tensai's side. "It's not Christmas yet, you have to wait to open the presents." Izuku turned to look for the new person speaking to him, but he couldn't see them. Tensai laughed and stepped forward so his little brother could be within sight of him. "Izuku, this is my brother Tenya," he introduced him, holding the boy's hand. The boy was a carbon copy of Tensai, just with more average-looking eyebrows and wearing extremely baggy briefs. He looked up curiously at Izuku in Nemurai's arms. "I'll set you down by the couch. Can you stand if you hold yourself up on it?" Nemurai asked Izuku, getting a nod from the boy. "All right." She let him down on his feet, giving him time to grasp the arm of the couch firmly with one hand before letting go of him. Izuku swayed a bit in place, but held himself up easily enough. "Go on, say hi," Tensai told his brother, letting go of his hand. Tenya walked, or more like marched, towards Izuku in movements too precise for a 2-year-old, and offered a hand to Izuku in a motion that reminded him of his toy robot. Tenya was a bit taller than him too, despite being younger, but Izuku didn't need to know that yet. "Hello, I'm Ida Tenya," he said once Izuku had grabbed his hand, shaking it in such a grown-up way it made Hisashi choke on the juice 𝐭𝐽 had offered him. Tensai sighed, wondering if his friends would try to blame him for his brother being so obsessed with acting like a pre-programmed robot for some unknown reason. "Hi. I'm Izuku." He introduced himself as well, grinning wide at the newcomer and shaking his hand faster, like how most kids would actually do. "Want to play?" Tenya found out Izuku's smile was contagious, and his entire posture seemed to relax as he nodded. Izuku walked around the couch, using his grip on it as a guide to his steps until he reached the space between it and the TV where he'd left some of his toys that evening before he and his mom started decorating. He carefully let himself down to sit on the floor, followed by Tenya sitting in front of him. Tensai had told Tenya of Izuku's situation, leaving out the more, unsavory parts and keeping it PG for his brother. The gist of it was that Tenya knew Izuku had trouble moving on his own other than crawling around, and he didn't comment on it. Izuku let Tenya pick an action figure first, and then picked one himself to launch into a made-up hero story with a sock puppet as the villain. "My hero's name is All Might Jr. What's yours?" he said, not noticing Toshinori hiding his face in his hands as his ears turned red. Tenya glanced at his brother. "His Ingenium." Izuku seemed to love the name. "Okay." The sounds of their play fights and the high-pitched voices of their pretend heroes let everyone in the room know they were doing all right. Tensai smiled as he looked at them, glad to see Tenya lose the typical stiffness he carried himself with and just be a normal kid with Izuku. At home he tried his best to spend time with his brother to let him experience the childhood he deserved, since Tensai had gone through the same during his own younger years but without the advantage of a sibling to play with him. But still Tenya had it very ingrained the importance of the Ida name and was set on being a proper hero in the future, so he tended to act more adult than he should. "I bet you were as cute as him at his age," 𝐭𝐽 commented casually, walking up to Tensai. He laughed, scratching the back of his neck. "Mom would agree with you." While the kids entertained each other, the newcomers produced their own presents to put under the tree, Tensai being the only one to place an extra one for Tenya, even if his brother knew his own presents would be back home waiting for him. 𝐭𝐽 had wanted to get something for everyone as well, but they insisted having them over was more than enough and threatened with burying the house in gifts after winter break if she even thought about it. They crowded around the kitchen counter since the living room was currently a battlefield between Izuku and Tenya's heroes versus the evil sock monster. Going at the snacks 𝐭𝐽 had set out like starved animals. They were high school students after all, Lord knew they were always hungry. Tensai was the only one with a hint of manners, pacing himself on a dango. 𝐬𝐽 tried to maintain a semblance of dignity, but that went away as soon as he noticed the plate of mochi off to the side, which he'd snatched and closed off everyone else in the crook of his arm. 𝐭𝐽 laughed, still taking more food out of who knows where and replacing the rapidly emptying plates. If everything goes well, I will be teaching the students how to make all this next year. Oh right, the home econ class, Tensai said. 𝐬𝐽 and Hisashi mentioned it a while ago. Nemuri grabbed a glass of juice that might have been 𝐬𝐽's and downed it in one go to clear her throat. Are we gonna get some of those before graduation? I like to think I can take care of myself, but you know, just in case. 𝐭𝐽 nodded, refilling her glass and sliding a new one to 𝐬𝐽 to get him to stop glaring daggers at Nemuri. You'd be the test class, see if it goes well to implement it officially next year. I can't cram that much information in the 3 months you have left, but you should leave knowing the basics of cooking, cleaning and home repairs at least. Wait, you know home repairs? Like plumbing and stuff? Toshinori asked, surprised. He tried to hammer a nail to a wall once to hang a picture at his place, and he'd ended up with no picture, no nail, and no wall. 𝐭𝐽 scoffed, throwing a dish towel at him. Of course I do. I can't exactly raise my son on my own if I can't handle a home by myself, you know. I can run finances and know a bit of electrical work and carpentry as well. Hisashi and 𝐬𝐽, being regulars in the house, already knew this bit of the story, as well as Nemuri since she had access to Tsukochi's files on the case. Tensai, however, leaned forward to be heard with how soft his voice had gone to not be heard by the kids. Midoriya-san, you're a single mother? He asked her, brows furrowing in concern. 𝐭𝐽 waved him off casually. It's nothing to worry yourself with, Tensai. I had a lot of time to learn how to do things by myself before Izuku was born. My ex-husband supports us financially though, so it lightens the workload, even though I work from home as well. She tapped her finger on her chin. Or rather, I used to. I had to submit my resignation after we were sent into witness protection. You seem awfully calm about it, 𝐬𝐽 said. 𝐭𝐽 shrugged, smiling at him tiredly and letting a bit of her exhaustion show in her eyes. The change in her expression during that single second she let her facade slip was jarring. If I don't cover up my worries, Izuku might try to carry them for me in the future. He doesn't deserve more on his platter, neither do you, Toshinori said softly, placing a hand on her back comfortingly. 𝐭𝐽 smiled up at him, her hand coming up to the part of his arm she could reach as silent thanks. The egg-shaped timer by the oven started ringing at that moment. 𝐭𝐽 hurried to take the chicken out while Toshinori went to fetch the kids. Boys, time for dinner, he called out, feeling a bit bad at interrupting their game but forgetting it at seeing how excited they got at the mention of food. He made to take Izuku up from the floor. Come on Izuku, I'll take you there. Actually, Tenya interrupted him, tapping his fingers together nervously. He looked at Izuku sitting down in front of him, staring back at him curiously. Could I help? Izuku seemed like he didn't understand what Tenya was talking about, looking to All Might for an explanation. But when he turned at the hero and saw him frozen in position, ready to help Izuku up, he understood. In a move no one had seen him do, nor believed he was capable of, Izuku turned away, completely ignoring All Might and reaching his hands out to his new friend. Tenya looked delighted at being given the chance, carefully standing up first and holding Izuku's hands firmly. I'll pull you up, okay? 1, 2, at the count of 3 he pulled, leaning back while Izuku pushed himself off the floor. Tenya, being a bit taller, helped them maintain their balance once Izuku was on his feet, their hands never letting go of each other as Tenya took careful steps back, head turning every few seconds to make sure his path was clear while he guided Izuku to the table. 𝐭𝐽 watched all this unfold with both hands covering her mouth, tears welling at the corner of her eyes as she saw how gentle Tenya was with her son, how the boy wasn't that much stronger than her baby, so Izuku might as well be taking his first solo steps on his own thanks to his friend. Tensai huffed out a laugh, pride gleaming in his eyes as he witnessed the live confirmation of just what kind of person his little brother was. Once they reached the table, Izuku stumbled a bit as he swapped to holding onto the chair's leg, grinning up at his mother at having made it there. Tenya looked really happy too, hovering behind Izuku as if eager to help in anything else the boy might need. Tensai walked up to them, ruffling Tenya's hair with a huge grin before helping him up to his seat, then turning and lifting Izuku up on his chair to make sure he would be strapped in properly while Tenya did his own himself, used to it already since he insisted on sitting at the big table back home since he could speak. Dinner went surprisingly as normal as it could go, with the variety of people sitting at the table while attacking everything on sight, with Toshinori being the biggest offender as he ate like he hadn't had a real home-cooked meal in decades. Tenya kept going off at the importance of eating a proper and balanced meal every day while Izuku nodded at everything he said, until Tensai pointed out the green peppers Tenya had been pushing to the edge of his plate, making his brother flush red and stare at the veggies with poorly concealed disgust as he forced himself to eat them to not make Izuku think he didn't follow his own preaching. "I might have to bring you here more often if that's how we can get you to eat those," Tensai teased, laughing as his brother crossed his arms and pouted. Tensai chuckled and dropped more chicken on Tenya's plate to make him smile again. "Did you tell Izuku about your quirk?" Izuku gasped, setting his fork down before he dropped it by accident. "You have a quirk already?" Tenya nodded, reaching down and rolling up his breathed leg to show off some tiny pairs of pipes protruding from the back of his calves. "They're engines, like my brother's," he poked at the pipes self-consciously. "They're too small though, they're so cool," Izuku exclaimed, smooshing his own cheeks in excitement. "They make you fast too." "Just a little," Tenya said. "I keep tripping when I try, that's what training is for, kid," Shouter added from across the table. Tenya looked at him, surprised. "You were lucky enough to be born with it, so you have even more time to practice. You are young though, don't push it," or Shouter, "that was so sweet, Nemurai cooed. Dump Hisashi and date me instead," Shouter snorted. "After all the trouble I went through to make him like me." "No thanks," Tensai derailed the conversation back to the kids before Nemurai and Hisashi started another one of their fake wars for Shouter's hand. "Why don't you show Izuku how your engines work? You know we grown-ups like to stay at the table talking about boring stuff." Tenya nodded, excusing himself as he slid down to the floor. Inko helped Izuku down and waited for Tenya to offer to help him once more. When Tenya went to hold Izuku's hands again, Izuku shook his head to everyone's surprise. I want to," he mumbled, looking down at his feet meaningfully. Tenya let his arms drop to his sides, giving him space while Izuku collected himself. He remained within reaching distance just in case, but didn't touch him. The ones sitting on the other side of the table stood up, their chairs screeching against the floor as they stared at the kids with impatient anticipation. Izuku stepped in place for a while, trying out his footing as he held onto the chair with both hands. He stomped his little feet with more and more force each time, getting his legs used to the work. He let one of his hands go, then the other to stand up still on his own. Then he lifted a foot and took a step forward. And another. And another. By the third step he tripped with his other foot and Tenya caught him before he fell, but only righted him up before letting go again. Izuku smiled at him and then kept going, making his way across the room. The silence was so thick it made the scene felt like it lasted forever, each of Izuku's steps an event of its own. But in reality the distance was no longer than 10 of his little steps, and before they realized he was already by the living room, reaching for the couch to hold onto. His face was red from the effort and he was breathing, letting himself fall to sit on the floor. Inko was openly crying, sobbing as she rushed from her seat to kneel next to her son, hugging the life out of him as words failed her but still trying to convey just how happy she was, how proud of those few steps Izuku had managed all on his own. "Please tell me you got that too," Nemurai said to Hisashi, whose phone was still up and recording everything that had just happened. "Of course I did," he choked out, not showing any signs of wanting to stop recording anytime soon, despite his own tears fogging up his glasses. Izuku didn't really understand why his mom was crying, and he didn't want her to be sad, so he used the best medicine he knew for sadness and hugged her back as tight as he could. Inko laughed through her tears, kissing his face and repeating over and over how proud she was and how happy he'd made her. "This is the best Christmas present I've ever gotten, baby," she said, chuckling when Izuku wiped her tears away with the sleeves of his sweater now that he knew she wasn't sad. Nemirai jumped up, phone in her hand. "Oh! Speaking of presents, it's been 4 minutes since midnight already." She walked towards the tree to fumble through the wrapped boxes. "Time for gifts." They all insisted. Izuku opened his first, and soon enough he was surrounded by the new pair of red sneakers from 𝐭, the winter scarf from �プ, the matching handmade hat from Hisashi, the picture book from both Idas, the action figure from Nemirai, and the giant white bunny-shaped pillow from Toshinori that was so big he could actually lie down on it. Toshinori also handed him a box of hot chocolate Naomasa had sent him since he couldn't make it due to work. 𝐭's presents varied from home decorations to make the new flat seem warmer and cozier, to a bottle of perfume, to a set of hair brooches, to the very expensive-looking and extremely comfortable sweater Toshinori had gotten her. It matched Izuku's bunny, he offered as explanation as the woman slipped into the snow-white garment, marveling at how soft and warm it was. "I love it. Thank you so much, Toshinori," she smiled excitedly, already knowing this would be her new favorite piece of clothing. "You can thank him again, you know," Nemirai cackled, pointing up at the ceiling above where they were standing. "Oh my, I don't remember hanging that there," 𝐭 said, staring at the decidedly not there before sprig of mistletoe hastily stuck to the ceiling with masking tape. "But since it's tradition." Toshinori was so shocked by the development of the little bundle of leaves and berries that he went down easily when 𝐭 pulled at his sweater, and could do little more than sputter when she planted a quick kiss on his cheek before letting go. "Nor, I think All Might just got the best present tonight," Hisashi snickered. Then he grabbed 𝐿𝑆hao's arm and pulled him forward. "Now's our turn." And with 𝐿𝑆hao turning the tables around and dipping Hisashi under the mistletoe, surrounded by the laughter of everyone around them and the warm fire crackling from the fireplace, Izuku sunk into his brand new pillow and dozed off with a smile on his face.